Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very special edition of Preemie Chats. It's not Friday, but we are getting together today to celebrate National Breastfeeding Week. So thank you for joining us. My name is Leah Whitehead, and I am a proud preemie mom of 28-weeker Tessa. And I'm also a volunteer with the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. I am broadcasting live today from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. They were reaffirmed in 1982 and remain active to this day. Aside from acknowledging with words, I hope to continue to learn more about how I can deeply engage and move forward the work of truth, reconciliation, and equity. I recognize that without action, an acknowledgement is empty. It marks the beginning of the work ahead for us, not the end. So thank you for acknowledging that with me today. Preemie Chats is produced by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, or also known as CPBF. It's a charitable organization, and its mission is to support and educate Canadian families of premature babies. This Preemie Chat series is one of the many ways that they do that. And it's, like I said, usually on Friday. And we talk with medical professionals, researchers, and parents who share with us their NICU experience and knowledge. We want you to be part of the discussion today. So please leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Engage with our speakers today. We have some amazing speakers, and ask them questions. We also would like you to check out CPBF's website. It's there on the screen, canadianpremies.org, and there you'll find all kinds of resources and support. Parents are the most important people, and intervention a baby can have in NICU, but we know that NICU can be disorienting. And so we hope that if you visit this website and look at some of the series, such as Welcome to the NICU, you'll feel just a little bit more at home in NICU and like you know what is happening. To apply for the parent care, right now also we have the parent care program. So that was developed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. People were facing fears and anxieties. And so the parent care program offers 4 therapy sessions for families currently in NICU or those who have been discharged up to 3 years. And so there you can also apply for the parent care program and watch the videos. Now on to today. We have an amazing lineup, as I mentioned, with some incredible speakers. We're going to cover a whole range of topics, including feeding in NICU, the newest research on the impact of breast milk on neurodevelopment, and one mother's breastfeeding journey through COVID-19. Thank you to our sponsor, Medela, for making special days like this one possible. We're going to kick off today by talking to Dr. Deborah O'Connor. Debbie is the Earl W. McHenry Professor and Chair of the Department of Nutritional Sciences and Acting Director of the Joanna and Brian Lawson Center for Child Nutrition in the Temerty Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. She also holds cross appointments in the Department of Pediatrics at Mount Sinai and in the Translational Medicine program at the Hospital for Sick Children. She is very interested in the area of maternal and infant nutrition, and much of her work has focused on early feeding strategies in very preterm infants to promote optimal growth, nutrition, and neurodevelopment. Today, she's going to be talking about parent milk feeding of the very preterm infant and neurodevelopment. Parent milk is considered precious and is often referred to as liquid gold. Research has found that compared with formula, parent milk is better tolerated, allowing for faster progression from parenteral to enteral feeding in infants born very preterm. It also has bioactive and immunomodulatory factors that may reduce the risk of sepsis and necrotizing enterocolitis. Dr. O'Connor is going to briefly review the evidence in support of the associations I just mentioned, and she will share some emerging research that suggests early life exposures to parent milk may additionally program later neurodevelopment through epigenetic modifications, changes in gene expression that do not affect the underlying gene sequence. I have to say, I'm glad you're here, Debbie, to walk us through this because it sounds complex, but I'm excited to learn about it. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Leah. That's fantastic. And hopefully with my brief slides, I will make this complex topic very simple. As Leah had mentioned, the title of my talk is Parent Milk Feeding of the Very Preterm Infant and Neural Development. So whenever I give this talk, I like to kind of start with the healthy term-born infant. What do we know about breastfeeding and its association with intelligence? And I'll draw your attention to this particular systematic review of the literature. There have been a few of them. I like this one because what it does is it considers studies that also look at adjustment for things like parent stimulation or interaction in the home, which could be a confounding variable in studying this association. So in this particular systematic review, they found 17 studies. And the bottom line, as indicated with this big star, is in primarily healthy term populations, breastfeeding is associated with improved performance on intelligent tests. And even if you control for maternal IQ, that association persists. So the question today is, what about the preterm infant? In that systematic review, like many of them, they don't really pull out preterm infants separately, but there is an old systematic review that was done that did so. And what they found was, again, among healthy term infants, you see this advantage in terms of mother's milk feeding on infant intelligence. And if you kind of remember that number from the previous slide, it's almost the exact same number. But when they pulled out the preterm infants separately, you can see that advantage is almost twice as much, which suggests that, and we've thought this for some time, that mother's milk may in particular have a differential advantage for the preterm infant. So the question is, what is it about parent milk that influences the neurodevelopment of infants? So there's a few things. I'm going to focus on the unique composition of parent milk. So looking at that milk drop to the right of your screen, you're going to see that mother's milk is full of things, right? It's full of nutrients. It's full of bioactive components such as antibodies, bacteria, which often is a good thing, believe it or not, growth factors, stem cells, oligosaccharides, and so on. So it provides optimal nutrition for all infants, provides optimal nutrition for preterm infants, and so they're growing, including their brain is growing. Additionally, providing parents' milk also reduces serious morbidities, probably because of these bioactive components that are in the milk. So if you look at the boxes there, you see parents' own milk reduces things like necrotizing enterocolitis, sepsis, severe retinopathy, and prematurity. And we know these things influence neurodevelopment. So the question that is beginning to emerge is, aside from these events that occur in hospital with mother's own milk use and growth and things like reducing morbidity, is the consuming mother's milk programming that infant for neurodevelopmental potential later on in life. And therefore, I'm going to introduce to you, and maybe some of you know this already, but this is introduce to you the concept of epigenetics. So in terms of your genes, your DNA is going to determine, things like how tall you are, your risk of chronic disease, things like diabetes. and it will influence neurodevelopment. Obviously, environmental exposures or whether you had milk or mother's milk or not is not going to change your DNA. That is going to stay the same. However, epigenetic changes affect gene expression by turning genes on and off. So you have your DNA, and epigenetic changes are things that will result in transcription or forming proteins or not forming proteins. And a whole variety of things affecting the preterm infant are under study about affecting these epigenetic changes. So some of the things are intrauterine growth restriction, exposure to drugs, etc., stress, are all thought to maybe long-term program for various outcomes. The one that I'm interested in is diet. So this has been looked at in terms of healthy eating in adults. People have started to look at this in healthy term-born infants, and virtually very few people have looked at it in terms of the preterm infant. Though there are many mechanisms for these epigenetic changes that would turn genes on and off, and I'm just going to focus on one. And you'll see this schematic here with the DNA. On the DNA, there are these sequences along there that bind methyl groups. They're called CPG sites. So they will bind methyl groups or not bind methyl groups. Depending on whether those methyl groups attached to those sites will turn the genes on and off. And we know things like diet can promote that or not promote that. So that's kind of the theory. So what we recently did, and we just published a paper 6 weeks ago on this, was we followed up 143 babies that were born less than 1,500 grams in our studies, and they came back at 5.5 years of age. And what we did was we collected DNA. We didn't need blood for this. We could do it by just using a light brush on the inside of the child's mouth, and we were able to collect the DNA from there. And what we did was we looked at all these CPG sites. So these are, again, in the whole genome, where these methyl groups will attach or not attach. And we looked at them, and we investigated whether mother's milk intake, we had very detailed data from in hospital, was related to these methylation at these sites. And what you see on the left-hand side is a graph. It's called a Manhattan plot. You don't need to know that. But a couple of sites really popped up as being very influenced by mother's milk intake. One of them is associated with things like development of hearing, and the other one is associated with things like antioxidant protection, which we know is very important in the preterm infant. But importantly, if we looked at all the top CPG sites, not just those two, they were all methylated in the same direction with mother's milk intake, meaning the more mother's milk intake, the less methylated these sites were. So there was a very strong signal. So you see our little schematic up in the right-hand corner, you see the check mark. So for sure, mother's milk intake in these preterm infants was associated with the DNA methylation at 5.5 years. So now this one is very complicated. But if you look at the genes that those CPG sites are on and look at their functions, you get a whole long list. And I'm just pulling up the ones that bang it right over the head. You can see these are all related to neural development, nervous system development, generation of neurons, neurogenesis, neuron differentiation. So it was just, we were really surprised when they saw this. It almost was unreal when we saw it. But we know what all these genes do, and these CPG sites that were differentially methylated as a result of in-hospital milk intake popped up with these particular genes. So, and then the last thing we did in the children that came back, we did neurocognitive tests with them at 5.5 years. And we measured their full scale IQ. And in a small subset, we also did brain imaging. And a few things that we saw, you can see on the bottom of that picture, we saw, like the systematic reviews showed before, we saw a relationship with mother's milk intake and the size of various brain structures, and was also related to full-scale IQ at 5.5 years, even controlled for things like maternal education and so on. But importantly, we saw those top CPGs, those top 20 CPGs were associated, in 6 out of the 20 CPGs were associated with the size of the brain structure, even though this was a really small sample size. And 1 of the 20 CPGs was associated with full-scale IQ of the children at 5.5 years. So the kind of take-home messages of this is that, number one, percentage of mother's milk intake is associated with neural development in early childhood and beyond for the preterm infant, as well as healthy term infants. The size of the benefit seems to be greatest for the very preterm infant, and that's believed due in part to what's going on while the baby's initially in the hospital, improved nutrition during hospitalization, improved brain growth, and the bioactive factors in mother's milk are reducing the risk of serious morbidity. And the last point is there's pretty emerging evidence to suggest that the provision of parents' milk in hospital might have lifelong programming effects on neural development through this epigenetic programming. So I'd just like to acknowledge, the very large network of hospitals and families that we've worked with over the years, and you can see some of them here. And I think Dr. Unger might be on the call today, and just want to acknowledge her and all the members of our research team. And in the middle of this photo in our backyard from about a week ago in the center is Amelia Zhu, who is the expert on this epigenetic programming, who led this particular study. So I'll just stop there and see if anybody has any questions or would like to learn something more about this topic.
Wow, I learned a lot, I have to say. Not only in when I was preparing the intro, I was making sure, trying to say all the words correctly, but to put them in context even. It's interesting that there's not a lot of research done on this topic. Right. And yet you guys kind of did a longer term, like you started it 5.5 years ago, essentially. Right. And so will you follow these kids even further?
Yeah, so this, so we followed, the study was finished before the pandemic, and so we were able to do those neural assessments in person. This was from our original Domino study. That was the study that showed that when you use donor milk instead of preterm formula as a supplement to mother's own milk, you could reduce the risk of necrotizing enterocolitis. And those families hung out with us. Half the families agreed to come back to do follow-up, which was really generous of them, I have to say. And to do these tests just to kind of look at some of the long-term outcomes. But the issue, Leah, is for us is we would love to follow them forever, but families move, and then eventually your sample size gets so small that there's kind of concern that the representation of that sample might not reflect the population. So we probably won't follow this particular group beyond 5.5, but with our other studies, we're trying to always bring them back at 5.5 years old.
So you're going to do more studies on this, right. I'm assuming.
Right.
Is that the next step in doing this? Because 143 would be considered a smaller sample size on the scale.
Oh, yeah. Right? Very small, but huge for preterm infants. Nobody's ever done this before with preterm infants. In fact, nobody's even done all the steps, because nobody has, like, we have every drop of nutrition that goes into the babies in hospital. We collect it. But so nobody has the detailed characterization that we have, could take it to that detailed feeding by direct measurements and going forward. But, you're right, 143 babies. this study screams for replication, right? So we will do that. We have a clinical trial up right now with 600 babies, and we will look for funding to follow those babies at 5.5 years and kind of look to see if we can find the same things, and then if we can replicate it. I will tell you, when I first saw this data, I thought it looked like we made it up. But it just really and I have to get the granting agencies. There was a couple reviewers for our grants who really pushed us to do this. And to be honest, it was a little outside my personal expertise. So I honestly, I didn't want to do it because it looked quite challenging, but we got our collaborators in place and we did it. And I have to tell you, it's obviously it needs to be replicated, but it does add another argument in support of why we need to support families to provide parent milk in hospital. And I know it's not easy, but we need to do it. We need to support families to do this.
And help me with the genetic side of things. Does it have to be the parent's milk, or can it be donor milk?
Well, okay, that's a really good question. It looks like the bottom line is it looks like the advantage is strongest for mother's own milk. I mean, in this study, we didn't, our studies where we take everybody in, but these individuals would describe themselves as mothers. So that's why I'm going to use it in this context.
Sure.
But it seems specific to mother's milk, right? I mean, donor milk, believe you me, I love donor milk. Donor milk is better than formula, but mother's milk, you're just not going to be able to replace that.
So what's the next step in terms of this information being shared with families? Because it seems like important information to be in the hands of NICU families.
Well, I mean, I guess today would be a good start to do this. Like, the study is, this was probably one of the hardest studies that I was ever involved with. It was like very complex. Hopefully I explained it in a way that you understood, because this is a new area for me as well. But I guess today is a start. And, if you have suggestions, we would love to, be involved in being able to do that. I know when we do the one thing in Southern Ontario, when we do our studies, our ongoing studies, we do share with families the research we've done in the past in that way. But we're open for additional suggestions. But I would view today as an important opportunity to get things out there. And hopefully I explained it in a way that was understandable to everyone.
You did very well, because it's not a simple concept. Like you said, it was daunting even to read the intro, but the way that you explained the epigenetics versus the genetics, I found that to be really clear. And so it is good when we can kind of break down that information in a way that's tangible for people.
Excellent.
Is there anything you want to share that I haven't asked you about today before we say goodbye?
No, that's what I was going to share. If anybody has any comments or suggestions, we love to hear from families. We do have a parent advisory. So, but if people are interested in this topic and have thoughts to improve what we do to help families, do not be shy.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. We appreciated having you on and for you sharing your exciting research. I can't wait to see what else, as it expands, what else you guys come out with.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, we'll see you. Our next guest is going to be talking about how to make sure baby gets every drop of this precious resource we've been talking about. Doris Dixon worked as a neonatal nurse, a clinical nurse specialist, and lactation consultant in Winnipeg for over 30 years. She has since retired, and she is working as a nursing consultant and as a clinical education facilitator for the University of Manitoba College of Nursing. She's also very busy because she's the chair of the board of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. Doesn't sound like she's retired to me. Doris has a passion for parents of sick and vulnerable infants. And today she's going to be sharing a review of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention guidelines for handling and storage of human milk, along with some tips for us. Welcome, Doris. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Leah. And thank you to Dr. O'Connor. That was a very nice overview of the cellular factors in breast milk and the bioactivity of it. I'm going to actually link that to some of the information I'm going to talk about, but I actually have the honor to present a topic that makes nurses roll their eyes but makes parents overwhelmed. I've often seen families get very overwhelmed about how breast milk is handled. So I'm going to try to make it simple and understandable. I'll start with an admission of how long I've been in neonatology. That back when I first started, most of us assumed that breast milk was a sterile fluid. That we certainly know a lot more about that now. A few years ago, maybe more than a few, we did this little study in the NICU because there's always the talk about how do you wash pumping kits. So we did a little study of moms pumping breast milk at home, and we tested then the bacterial content from kits that were washed in soap and water and kits that were sanitized. Now, there's a difference between sterilized and sanitized. And our infectious disease consultant made it very clear to us that you don't use the word sterilized unless you're actually using proper sterilization. So when people sanitize in a dishwasher or a microwave, it's not sterilized, it's not sterile, but it is cleaner than just washing by hand. So we compared hand washing or washing by hand in a basin kits compared to sanitizing with a microwave sanitizing bag. We found that breast milk often had the same bacteria that we generally have on our hands, with less amounts in the sanitized kits, but not levels that would cause disease. So we were very happy to see that the kits that were washed in soap and water really didn't seem to have the burden of bacteria that would make the infant sick. Some of the samples we found contained bacteria that could potentially cause disease, but generally at pretty low levels and not consistent from sample to sample with the same mother. So we took that as a note that yes, there can be some very potentially dangerous bacteria in breast milk, and that handling practices are very important. But we also recognize that the mother is a microbiome and the home is part of that environment, and that the milk also contains antibodies that potentially deliver protection to the various microbes that are in that mother's home and that mother's environment. So it's a balancing act, and milk is just one of those fluids that is really a very important part of that balancing act, especially for the newborn. So since doing this study, we generally know that there's a wide range of culturable microbes that reside within breast milk and human milk, and they change from area of the world to another area of the world. So they're very specific to where you live and to your home in particular. These microbes are very important to the baby, help them develop good bacteria in their own systems. It's very important for the gut to become colonized with this bacteria for digestion, but also to help balance and unbalance the growth of harmful bacteria. So the bacteria in breast milk really has an important role to play. So you don't want to sterilize breast milk, but you also need to ensure that it's handled appropriately. but it did help us become comfortable with the practice of washing breast milk kits in soap and water. Important to note, breast milk is the only substance that is subject to both good food handling practices and also body fluid practices. And this was not something that we understood when I was a fledgling nurse. We certainly didn't make these distinctions then. And sometimes it's difficult for nurses to wrap their heads around that, both food handling and body fluid handling. And so I can understand how confusing it can be for parents. Families may notice that the measures that are outlined in the CDC guidelines, and at the end, Leah's going to put a link to those so that anyone can actually get those guidelines in a really nice infographic online. They're going to be somewhat different in your hospital potentially than you're going to do at home. And that's because hospitals are an environment where there are many people in often small areas, and there's potential for cross-contamination. And you don't really want your home environment crossing over with the next mother's home environment or the next family's environment. You want to try to keep your environment as tight as possible. And so preventing cross-contamination is one of the most important things for handling within the hospital. The other consideration is that the rate of bacterial growth is different in different storage facilities or locations. And it's this rate of bacterial growth that's really important when they provide guidelines on times that breast milk can stay in certain locations. And it's a very rich environment. So we know that breast milk provides a lot of sustenance for the microbes. So we need to be careful about that. So it's a really fine balancing act. And the Centers for Disease Control have published these guidelines for storage and preparation of breast milk, which most institutions incorporate into their institutional practices, policies, guidelines, whatever. It starts with some basic reminders to wash your hands with soap and water. And if there's anything that this pandemic has taught us, it's about how to wash our hands. And I suspect many of us have fallen out of that since the early stages of the pandemic, but it's something that we need to continue to come back to. Storage is the next topic, and number one is containers. And a lot of hospitals will provide containers for families to use, and it's really important that you use those containers because they're generally researched and certified to not contain known harmful chemicals. Now, we all know that there's constantly information and new information coming about plastics in particular. And so we really want to stay on top of that so that hospitals continue to look at which chemicals are the most likely to leach into breast milk and which ones we need to avoid, and ensure that your containers are actually safe. The ones that you use at home, again, should be food grade and designed for breast milk. So mothers that are using other containers at home, just be very aware that this is something that is marketed specifically for human milk. So a few basic details then about storage. So 4 hours at room temperature. So this means that you don't have to be in a panic after you pump, because the milk is safe for 4 hours. If you're going to pump and your baby is due to feed, within that 4-hour period, that's the best milk to be used, is the milk that you've pumped within that 4 hours. And it can stay at room temperature quite safely. But if you're not going to use it within those 4 hours, then it needs to go into a refrigerator. And it should be in a refrigerator for up to 4 days. At home. In a hospital, they may use it for less time. So be aware, very aware of what the practices are in your hospital. But at home, according to the CDC, it can be in the fridge for up to 4 days. If you're not going to use it within those 4 days, then it should go into the freezer. And the CDC says 6 to 12 months for the freezer. Now, this is because there's so many different iterations of freezers. A freezer inside a fridge. So you open the door of the fridge and there's actually a little freezer compartment inside. Those are more old school, but they certainly haven't gone away. those are going to be probably not even quite 6 months, because in that freezer, the temperature can vacillate widely the more often the freezer is open. A freezer above the fridge, so that small freezer with a separate door, probably 6 months is the upper limit of how long you would put it in that freezer. But 12 months in a large chest freezer that isn't accessed quite as often. Don't store the milk in the door of the fridge or freezer. That's an important thing, because that's where the temperature vacillates the most. And the more the temperature goes up and down, the more bacterial growth you're going to see. So it's important to understand the reason for why these recommendations are in place. Also, the safest place in the fridge or freezer is going to be towards the back, where it's going to see the least amount of influence of the warmer temperature when the door opens. And it's kind of similar to how vaccines are stored, which are usually in the center towards the back of a fridge. And that's where you're going to get the most reliable temperature. Important when you're filling containers, leave an inch at the top so that for expansion when it freezes. And if you have to travel, or if you have to ship milk. So there's a lot of families who don't live that close to the hospital and they have to send milk or ship milk. In Manitoba, we have milk that comes into the hospital from all places in the north, and it's very safe for 24 hours to have that milk. So frozen milk in a cooler, an insulated cooler with ice packs. It can be 24 hours. Certainly you're going to try for less than that, but it certainly can go and probably not be adversely affected to too large a degree in that case. Now, thawing milk is the next step, of course, when milk has been frozen. Thawing milk, thawed in lukewarm water and never in a microwave. Important to note that a microwave can destroy the cells, and all these bioactive cells, they're quite fragile, and you don't want to subject them to any microwave activity. So do not thaw milk or warm milk ever in a microwave. So once it's thawed, so once it comes to room temperature, that's not for when you take it out, but once it actually is fully thawed and you've sort of you kind of swirl milk. You don't want to shake it vigorously, because that will destroy some of the cells potentially. You want to swirl milk, always swirl milk. And that will kind of distribute the ice crystals. Once it reaches room temperature, use it within 2 hours. Again, never refreeze milk. If you've thawed milk and then you don't need it, never refreeze it, because now you have a double chance of losing cells from the freezing process. There's always something that's lost when you freeze milk. And if you freeze it twice, you're doubling that. And so the milk is just not going to have the same nutritional value. It's not going to overly harm the milk in terms of bacterial. It's not going to make the baby sick, but you're just not going to get the same nutritional value from that milk. And as we heard from Dr. O'Connor, that nutritional value is extremely important. And it's those bioactive cells that are going to give you all those long-term benefits that you really want to preserve in that milk. And really, when you're working with milk and handling and storage, that's what you have to have in your mind. You have to have this understanding of how precious it is and why, and treat it like that fragile treatment for the baby. It's really more than a medication. There's no medication that can increase your IQ. And when you think about it, there's really no chemical or substance that can increase a baby's IQ better than breast milk or human milk or mother's milk or whatever you want to call it, whatever works for you. So feeding milk, contrary to popular belief, milk does not need to be warmed to be fed to a baby. So for the very tiny premature babies in the NICU, you're going to see nurses feeding warm milk. And that's because cold milk can cool the baby and have some adverse effects. But as the baby grows, room temperature milk is perfectly fine. And when a baby, a full-term baby, a large baby, you can feed cold milk and it's perfectly safe. It's just as nutritious cold as it is warm. So it's important to know that because a lot of people really fret about how warm the milk needs to be for the baby. And then the baby develops these tendencies that start to make it very difficult for multiple individuals to feed that baby. So there's really no need that when your baby is starting to orally feed. It's different when the milk is fed by tube directly into the stomach. And that's why the nurses will warm that milk, but not really much more than room temperature. It should never feel more than just slightly warmed if you test it on your wrist. Again, it's a body fluid, so you're really not doing that a lot. But if you're the parent or family of that baby, that's perfectly acceptable to do. So feeding warm milk when they're orally feeding, taking it from a bottle or a cup or a spoon, the mouth is going to warm that milk. And so really it's not necessary to bring that milk to really warm temperatures. Again, leftover milk, and this is a big question for a lot of families. Well, what do I do with that little bit that's left over? Well, you can use it for 2 hours. So once it's ready to feed and is at room temperature out of the fridge or out of the freezer, then room temperature, and then out of the fridge, whichever way you're going with that milk, once you're finished feeding, another 2 hours, you can keep it around. You're not going to be adding things to it or anything like that. You're not going to rewarm it. But there's so many babies when you feed them, and then they sort of have a burp or have a poop. And then they really want a little top up. It's nice that you can actually use that same feeding for within 2 hours. And then the final thing I want to talk about is cleaning. So washing pumping equipment and any feeding supplies with soap and warm water in a clean basin. Sinks are not as clean as you think, and drains are particularly notorious for bacteria. If you run a tap that goes into your drain, you're actually aerosolizing a lot of bacteria and all kinds of other microbes that live inside that drain. So you want to avoid any contact anywhere near a drain. So you want to use a clean basin, and then you air dry it on a clean cloth. So wash with soap and water in a basin, lay it out on a clean paper towel or other kind of clean towel to let it air dry. And once it's air dried, put it in a protected area so that sort of any kind of bacteria in the air aren't going to land on it. Other types of sanitizing I've already alluded to. You can use a dishwasher on, some have sanitized settings, a higher temperature setting is what you're looking for. Or you can use these microwave bags that are designed for this purpose. And often they have little tick boxes and can be used for a certain number of uses. And you can find these bags in stores wherever pumping equipment is sold. And those are quite effective as well if you want to go to the next level in terms of cleaning your equipment, especially if your baby is fairly young, fairly small, extremely premature, quite vulnerable. So have conversations. And that's the most important thing. If you're confused, if you're not sure, have conversations with your healthcare providers. Talk to your baby's nurse, talk to the infection control practitioner in the hospital if that will help you. Talk to the dietitians, who are unbelievably good sources of information for families and for staff. So I want to leave you with a few tips for effective pumping, because I know that this is an important issue. Pumping 8 times a day is really difficult, especially when you have other children. So one of the things that I always talk to mothers about is look at your daily routines, plan out your pumping. Start with making sure that you pump first thing in the morning, last thing at night, and once in the night in between. And after that, fit in 5 more pumpings. And people get stuck on the every 3 hours and think that it needs to be 3 hours apart. But that's not really the case. That's not how babies feed. And that's really not how you need to pump. As long as you pump as often as you can and aim for 8 times in a day, pump every 2 hours for part of the day. Take advantage of the time that you're with your baby. So if you're going to be in the hospital and doing skin to skin time, then pump before and after skin to skin so that you can really take advantage of that time. If you only have the ability to be there for short times, take advantage of the better quality pumps that the hospital has, if they have those, and pump more often there. Pump 2-3 times while you're there visiting your baby. Pump beside your baby's bedside to take advantage of that bond that you have. And then when you're at home, try to create an area of your home where you can have a comfortable place to sit, a place for a glass of water, quiet music, pictures of your baby, whatever it takes. Have a cloth that's been on your baby around your neck. Everybody's going to be a little bit different in how they can relax their body to really provide the best letdown of milk. If you're struggling with milk supply issues, and that is the number one thing in my 23 years of being a lactation consultant, that's the most common issue that I address with families was milk supply issues. Make sure that you have conversations with your baby's nurses, dietitians, lactation consultants about what you're doing, what you're pumping with, how you can leverage whatever you can to improve your milk supply. And know that not everybody can make enough milk. It's very difficult. It's very challenging. But we know that it is a dose response, like Dr. O'Connor was talking about, that any amount of milk is going to give a benefit. And it's important for you to know that you're not a failure if you don't provide a full amount or a half amount. But you just do the best you can, just like every parent in every part of parenting. So I'm going to leave you with that and see if there's any questions.
Thank you. I was scrolling down a question as you were wrapping up there. So we do have a question from someone who's watching. Petya has a question. Started off by saying, my supply was amazing and I had a super good supply, but that stash has run out. Any ideas on relaxation? My baby is 5 months, 2 months corrected, and I stopped pumping in the last couple of weeks due to time.
So the question is, and I'll just talk more generally about relaxing to get your milk supply up. Really, really common that milk supply dwindles after the first month. And often it dwindles or starts to decrease. So it'll decrease whenever you have a stressful event.
Sorry, Doris, there's a correction there. She said relactation. So it was just a
relactation.
There.
Okay.
Yes, there we go.
Relactation. Probably for relactation, you would probably need to have a conversation with your doctor about maybe getting what we call a galactagogue. So the galactagogues most commonly used in Canada are domperidone, potentially, or Maxaran. Talk to a lactation consultant, talk to somebody who runs a breastfeeding clinic to see if maybe they can help you get a prescription. Doing it without a prescription can be done. There are lots of herbs out there, and you can go to Dr. Newman's sites and they review all kinds of herbs that will help kind of kickstart those hormones. It's the prolactin you have to kind of re-kickstart. The number one way for relactation is to pump, 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 pump. So pump a lot. And if you pump a lot, that will help. If you want to start just by pumping a lot, so pump every hour. And so I would get moms to do something called power pumping, where they would pump for 10 minutes, off for 10 minutes, pump for 10 minutes, off for 10 minutes, and do that for 3 rounds. And then you kind of relax. And that really might get your prolactin trigger in your brain back into gear. So there's a couple of kinds of things that you can do. So pumping in bursts like that, pumping for longer periods, like make sure that you pump for a good 20 minutes. Even if it's not flowing, pump even if it's not flowing. And then look into herbs. Herbs are a little less studied and a little less reliable, but they can be really helpful. And like I said, the Dr. Newman websites, Jack Newman's websites are still around, and they still review a whole bunch of them. And then there's prescriptions that you can talk to your doctor or nurse practitioner or midwife about.
And if they were already on domperidone, would it be the same prescription or would they have to get that adjusted at all?
Yeah, same prescription. Yeah. And
Okay.
unfortunately, we can't use the same dosages that we used to use. So work very closely with your doctor about that, about whether your doctor thinks it's safe for you to go on a higher dose. And it really all depends on risk factors and cardiovascular risk. So you really need to work close with your doctor, but don't let it go. Don't let it slide. Really get on top of it. And advocate for yourself with your healthcare providers.
We have another question here from Terry who's watching. Do parents have to sanitize their kit every 24 hours if washing their kits with soap and water after each use?
So the CDC guidelines at home are soap and water, which means no, you don't have to. But what does your hospital require you to do or request you to do? So the hospital might have different requirements for your baby who's in the hospital, and different requirements for the kit that you use in the hospital versus the kit that you use at home. But simply following the CDC guidelines is simply wash it with soap and water and you're fine.
So my questions are many, but I just want to clarify a few things you said when you were talking about the pumped milk. So in the ideal world, is it best to give your baby the milk that you've just pumped and then potentially never access the stuff you've stored? Like if you can stay on top of it, is that even possible? As a NICU mom, I know that it felt like I was always pumping, so I don't even know if that kind of cycle would work, but what do you think?
Absolutely. The fresher the better. There's just no doubt about it. If you're, there are moms who are around all the time and are always able to give the freshest milk. So absolutely. The baby that always gets the freshest milk is going to be the happiest and have the best digestion and everything. Like there's absolutely no doubt about it. So the challenge with that is coordinating with your nurses. And we do so many additives in the hospital, and every hospital has different processes. And so sometimes you're caught between what you want and what they can do. It's important not to get too frustrated with that. It's not like you're losing out. I suspect from the study, from Dr. O'Connor's study, a lot of that milk was sitting in fridges, and you saw that it still has twice as much benefit on IQ than the term babies. So even milk that goes through the different processing in the hospital, like storing and mixing and freezing and thawing, it still has incredible amounts of bioactive factors. So yes, as much as you can pump and feed, that would be the best. Absolutely. In an absolutely ideal world, that is exactly what you would do. And in an ideal world, and there's lots of questions about additives, especially from nurses, the sooner you add it, the closer to feeding time that you add it, the better, because milk changes as additives sit in it, and we don't 100% know what those changes all are. There's not a lot of people studying those things. There's a group at the University of Manitoba. Bill Deal Jones is one of the researchers who looks at gut cells and looks at changes in additives. And he was the one that put a bug in my ear about how additives can change in milk. But again, that's an ideal world where you mix the milk and then immediately feed it.
Is there anything that you want to leave us with before we say goodbye?
Well, I just want to say that the real heroes are the families, and do the best you can. Look at your mental health and what's the best that you can do, because a healthy mom and a healthy family is the most important thing for a baby. So I know breastfeeding is an amazing thing, but I just want to commend anyone that does any amount of it. And so that's what I want to leave you with.
Thank you. We couldn't talk about this whole journey without also including parent voice. And so we have Addie Chilcott with us today. And we know that breastfeeding can be physically and emotionally challenging, and it's especially for that of parents of premature babies. Addie Chilcott is a preemie mom whose daughter was born at 31 weeks in June of 2021. Addie's hope is that through sharing her story, other preemie moms don't feel as alone or isolated in their experience, regardless of how they choose to feed their baby. She's going to share with us the challenges she faced with breastfeeding, pumping, and ultimately transitioning to formula, specifically speaking to the struggles she faced throughout this journey from a mental health perspective. Addie, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm so glad that you're here. It's not always easy to share a personal NICU story. So thank you for agreeing to come on and share about your journey. Oh, you're muted there.
Thank you for having me. And thank you to Fabiana for asking me to speak today. I'm really excited to share.
I'll leave you to it. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is my daughter in these photos here. Her name is Lily. She was born at 31 weeks last June. So this is somewhat of a recent experience for me. And I'm back to work now. So I'll just give, I guess, a brief overview of kind of my story, and then I'll talk a little bit about my breastfeeding experience. So I had a very healthy pregnancy all the way through. There were really no red flags at all. Nothing unusual, and ended up starting to go into labor around 30 weeks and 5 days or so. I'll spare the details of the entire birth story, but needless to say, it was days long as they tried to stall the contractions and the labor while they were able to give me the steroid injection for Lily's lung development, which was a win for us. We were able to hold it off for 48 hours while she got that steroid. Ended up delivering at 31 weeks and 2 days. And to say that it was a traumatic experience, I think, is an understatement. I was pretty much in survival mode, I think, for the entire time I was leading up to her delivery. It really was a numbing experience. I think I was, my mind was focused on the task at hand and executing that task. And I don't think I allowed myself to feel those feelings until after she was born. So she was born. We had that beautiful moment of hearing her cry right away, which was, a sigh of relief for my husband, Mitchell, and I. And I was able to hold her for about 60 seconds. They were literally counting down 60 seconds. I heard them 10, 9, 8, while they did the delayed cord clamping, at which time they took her, whisked her off to the team of doctors that was standing waiting for her. Following that, once I made my way back to my recovery room, I had a visit from a nurse very shortly after delivery. She brought in a little plastic cup. It was smaller than a Dixie cup, very small little plastic cup, and a small little syringe. And she explained to me, I'm going to have to start hand expressing for colostrum, so that initial milk that you produce right after delivery. This was nothing that I was expecting right away. All this crazy stuff had just happened, and now it was time for me to start providing breast milk. So I started doing hand expression. They showed me how to do it. I was lucky in that I was able to get around 1 or 2 mils right off the bat, which they told me was great. So I would, I spent every 2 hours or so, I would hand express as much as I could. We'd fill up the little syringe with whatever I was able to get, and my husband would walk down to the NICU and drop it off for our daughter. So we were also lucky in that she was only on CPAP for about, she was never on oxygen, and she was only on the CPAP for about a week or 10 days. So we had, we had a lot of luck there, but in the first week, she was receiving a lot of donor milk while my supply came in. And at one point, she did start to reject the donor milk. So she started spitting up sort of like green, black bile. They had to stop giving milk altogether, and they had suspicions that she might have NEC, but it ended up not being the case. She just was not tolerating the donor milk very well. So she had an IV placed in her umbilical cord before it healed over. That was like very important to them to get to it before it healed. So they inserted that, and she was fed basically on IV fluid for about 2 days until she was able to start being reintroduced to breast milk. At which time, over those 2 days, I was slowly like building up a small supply of whatever I was able to hand express and pump, and they started reintroducing it to her. We worked our way up right from 1 ml all the way back up to 7, which was the amount she was getting when she started rejecting it the first time. So I remember when we got to that 7 mils, and then we went up to 8, 9, 10, we got up to 15 mils, and my husband and I just celebrated, and we were so happy. So from there, our NICU journey we were there for about 6 weeks. So right now we're probably at about a week and a half to 2 weeks in terms of the timeline. It wasn't until probably 3.5 or 4 weeks in that I was able to start actually trying to orally feed her at the breast. So between then and the 3.5 week mark, I became very close with my pump. We spent a lot of time together, and I would call it a love-hate relationship. Absolutely. I was using the hospital grade pump, and I had to rent one as well as use the one when I was in the hospital visiting at the NICU. So I tried to, as much as possible, prioritize a little bit of rest time at home. But as anyone who's gone through this experience knows, you will pretty much sacrifice everything to be in the hospital with your baby as much as possible. I know with COVID, there's been a lot of challenges. I was fortunate in that I was able to spend 24 hours a day there if I wanted to. My husband was not allowed at the same time, but I spent a lot of time there. And so I was pumping and building my supply, and it was enough at that time to sustain her feeds, as they were pretty small still as she grew. And obviously being so small and premature, we couldn't even try to do any kind of oral feed until she was like 3.5 or 4 weeks old, because even taking her out to weigh her every day was like a marathon for her. That was enough for her for the day. She slept through most of her feeds as she was getting fed through the NG tube, and so once the time came that we were able to start, she's strong enough, she's alert enough that we can start to try and orally feed. Her dips on the monitors were not as frequent, and she's improving. So they let me know that we could start introducing bottles, or we could spend 7 days straight trying to put her to the breast. So that's what I wanted to do. I was really determined to breastfeed her the old-fashioned way. And so I was basically lived there for that week, didn't leave the hospital except to shower and change, and then I was right back there. I did not want to miss one single feeding, because every feeding that we were able to put her to the breast was practice for her. So over the course of that week, we had some small wins, some really big loses, and a really tired mama. So we came to the end of that week, sort of, consulting with her healthcare team at the time, and they sort of let me know that, if you want to go home, we might have to start considering introducing the bottle as well. You know, it was explained to me, you have all the time in the world when you get home to work on putting her to the breast and having her breastfeed that way. But, you know, the reason it's such a struggle for the preemies to go to the breast as opposed to the bottle is just it's a lot more work for them to extract milk. They have to get that proper latch. So it's a lot more complicated for them, and they're at a huge disadvantage having not had that developmental process in the womb like they were intended to with the suck, swallow, breathe. So, you know, I spoke to my husband about it. We kind of talked it through a little bit and decided, you know what, yeah, like we want to get her home. We want to be all at home together, and maybe the stress that I'm feeling being in the hospital will, you know, ease up a little when we get home, and I can focus on this more wholeheartedly. So that's what we did, and we started introducing more bottle feeds. We still tried to put her to the breast first to try and get the practice, and then we had a bottle ready, and we would finish the feeding that way. So as we were making progress with her bottle feeding, you can see a photo of my husband there giving her a bottle. We had to feed her on the side that way so that she wouldn't have too many dips on her monitor. So as we made progress with that, we were getting closer and closer to that discharge, you know, that ideal discharge day. And she was doing really well. Eventually, she got her feeding tube out, and she did a full 24 hours of oral feeds just with the bottle. So I said, you know what, let's see if she can do a full 24 hours orally feeding, but I'm not going to try and push her by putting her to the breast. I'm just going to let her do it with the bottle, and we'll see if she can do it. And sure enough, she did. So it was, I think, 24 hours after that we were able to come home. Best day ever. I mean, it really was bittersweet, to be honest, because you get used to having all that support. And, you know, I didn't have my lactation nurse coming to see me multiple times a week when I came home, especially with COVID. So once we got home, I was still very determined to try and get her to breastfeed at the breast. So I had a routine. I would put her to the breast first. I tried all sorts of different positions. I tried expressing while she was breastfeeding. I tried, you know, everything. But it seemed to be that no matter how long she would be there feeding, and I would hear the swallowing, I would hear, you know, the latch looked good. It was not painful. She seemed to be, like I could hear her breathing and sucking and swallowing, and it seemed fine. But I'd leave her there for, like, she'd go for like 45 minutes. And I would think that she was, you know, done, and then I'd pull her off and I was still full. Like she was having a really hard time emptying the breast, and I would end up having to pump after for another, you know, 20 to 30 minutes to empty. So thus began, you know, the long process that every feeding would last like an hour, because I would put her to the breast and then I would pump afterwards while she slept, and I would maybe get 20 minutes in between, and then she was hungry again. So I thought, okay, like something's got to give with this. This is not sustainable. I'm exhausted. My husband can't do anything to help me because, you know, I'm the one providing the milk. So, you know, after a lot of trying, I think probably for a solid month after she came home, I really tried to get her on the breast, but it just wasn't happening. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go solely pumping. I'm going to be a full-time pumping mom. So I committed once again to my pump and ended up coming up with some kind of a system that was a little bit more sustainable for me, where I would pump at the same time as I would feed her. So I was able to cut out that, you know, 20 to 30 minutes of breastfeeding time and get a little bit of rest in between. And this worked for me for a while, I would say. So ultimately, I ended up breastfeeding her with pumped breast milk for 5 months. It was probably at about the 3-month mark where it was really starting to take a toll on me, mentally, physically, emotionally, and like in every way. I wasn't feeling connected. I dreaded feeding times. I would hear her wake up ready to feed, and and overwhelm would come over me, and I would have to, you know, go get the pump and you set it up and, you know, all of this stuff. And anyone who's pumped before knows that it's a huge inconvenience. You know, we'll do what we have to do. And that's kind of what my mentality was at the time. So, yeah, I would say 3 months in, I started struggling. And it wasn't until ultimately it got to be too much for me. So we were at about 5 months old for my daughter, like 3 months corrected. And I said to my husband, like, I don't think I can do this anymore. Like, this is just, it's too much. Like, it's not sustainable. I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm just like a pumping machine. And to say that it was a difficult decision is an understatement. To switch her from breast milk ultimately to formula, which is what we ended up doing around 5 or 6 months. We slowly weaned her off. But what I will say is that for parents of preemies, and I know this for a fact because I've talked to other moms of preemies and I've read the stories, and I know that I'm not alone in this feeling, but you can tend to feel like your body really failed you already once. I felt like I failed her in not being able to bring her to term in pregnancy. And because of that, she had all these, you know, health concerns, and she was, you know, so fragile and, you know, in the hospital, and seeing her go through all of that, that this was my way. Breast milk was my way of like making it up to her. I thought in my head, you know, that this is how I'm going to repay her. And I owe this to her to give her, because I knew the benefits of breast milk. I knew how important it was specifically for preemies to get that nutrition. And as we've heard the speakers talk today about the benefits of breast milk, like these were things that I knew, and I really wanted to provide that to her. But I would say if there's like a main takeaway from my story, it would just be to the other moms out there who are struggling with pumping or trying to breastfeed your preemie and considering formula but feeling guilty. I would say give yourself a little bit of grace. I think I could have used that at the time for myself. I was really hard on myself. I remember the first bottle of formula I ever gave my daughter. I sat there in tears, streaming down my face as I fed it to her, because I just felt like I'm failing you again. So there's a lot of emotion wrapped up in this for any woman who's had a baby and tried to breastfeed, but especially for the preemie moms who have gone through this trauma and, dealing with postpartum depression as well as PTSD, and working through all of that with a trauma specialist and, another therapist as well. I was able to come out, and now I'm able to speak to this experience, but I know it's raw for a lot of people, and it's a lot more emotional than I think I ever expected. Everybody says breastfeeding is so hard, but I never really understood why. So yeah, that's my story, and I think that's my main takeaway. And I hope that like sharing this can be helpful for someone. And yeah.
Addie, thank you so much for sharing your story and for the bravery and vulnerability it takes to share something that, breastfeeding and chest feeding, it's an intimate experience. And I think you're underscoring something that's really important, and that is that it is a very difficult thing to do in a high stress environment. And so I'm just wondering, and I hear that a lot about people, wanting to go home. And so it's like, if you just get them on the bottle, then you can go home and deal with breastfeeding at home, which, it's so tough to establish it then. So I'm just wondering, like, what kind of supports could have been in place for you?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of support in the hospital while I was there, and like constant visits from lactation consultants, and like I knew everything that I was supposed to be doing. I knew what the latch was supposed to be. I knew how to help her with it. All the different positions I could try with her. It was not really a supply issue for me. I was able to get enough supply. It was just and it wasn't really a latch issue for her either. She latched well. It was her ability to extract the milk. So it was almost like a strength of her muscle that was the problem. So I don't know in my situation if I would have benefited from more lactation consulting or visits from a breastfeeding nurse to my home, which of course were not available at the time because of COVID anyways, but had they been available, I really don't know if it ultimately would have made a difference for me and my daughter. You know, sometimes it's the mom that's struggling, sometimes it's the baby, and I think for me it was like both. We just weren't able to get that to be effective. So.
And you underlined a very important thing too about it being about the relationship. And I think when you feel that overwhelm, like there should be that bonding and relational experience with feeding, right? That you kind of had to give yourself the freedom to experience.
Yeah. And I so badly wanted that. I so badly wanted to experience that like beautiful bonding moment that moms talk about when they look down at their baby when they're breastfeeding and they just have like this connection and this like emotional, you know, like bond. And I didn't experience that. I don't think I did experience that. Maybe once, but not really. I think it was wrapped up in a lot of frustration for me. I was constantly just sitting there going like, try this, like, you know, just come on, like, let's do it, like, work harder, or what am I doing wrong? Like, it was a lot of frustration. I never had that special bond with breastfeeding. I will say though, once I did start feeding her with a bottle, still breast milk, but once I was able to start feeding her with a bottle, I was able to experience that from time to time when I was not also pumping, because that kind of did take away from it sometimes. And ultimately, when we ended up taking her off breast milk entirely and feeding formula, I had a lot of relief from that. I experienced a lot of relief emotionally from doing that and making that decision. But yeah, I don't think I would have changed anything at the same time.
Well, thank you again for sharing your story. I think it's a familiar one to so many NICU parents. And I applaud you for what you did, because even doing that for the 5 months, that's a marathon when it comes to pumping and feeding. And like you said, you knew the benefits and you pushed through for that. And it's amazing. And I think it just, it shows the things we do for our kids, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you, Addie. It was great having you here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And our next guest is addressing a concern that is very common in NICU, and that is transitioning from tube feeding to breastfeeding and chest feeding. So we are going to get right to it. Rebecca Hoban is a neonatologist and director of breastfeeding medicine at Sick Kids, and she's an associate professor at the University of Toronto. So she's going to give us some quick hits with goals and expectations for the transition from tube feeds to oral feeds and breastfeeding and chest feeding, with a focus on common parent questions, which one of the big ones is nipple confusion. I know I hear that one a lot. And breastfeeding when a baby is on fortified feeds. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hoban.
Hi, good afternoon.
We have a little issue with your microphone. It's a little buzzy.
I talk into my laptop.
Yeah, you might need to take out your earbuds. Okay, no, it's still quite fuzzy there.
I'm on earlier when we
Oh, technology works when we don't need it. Oh.
I can see. sorry, I'm gonna try my other laptop. As I tried this ahead of time. Alright, me in on another.
Okay, we'll give Rebecca a moment to switch
Sorry again.
computers here. There, we'll try that one. Oh, that sounds better already.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yes,
Okay, let me
clear
sign
as
out the other
day
one.
now.
Now I'm echoing. Okay. Okay. All right.
Wonderful.
Now, unfortunately, my desk is messy behind me because you weren't supposed to see this view, but what can you do?
It just shows that you're working, right?
So are you pulling up my talk? Here we go. Okay, let me make sure I can.
All right.
And I on my desktop I can't make my slides go forward.
Okay, you just let me know and I'll advance them for you.
Okay, let's advance them. My own disclosure is that I do occasionally give talks for Medela, but this is not one of them. Next slide. So as we discussed, we're going to talk about the transition from tube feeds to oral feeds. We're going to talk about evidence for direct breastfeeding, again, with the caveat that we know not all, that's not possible for all babies or all families, but I will share the evidence for that. And then some common questions that I get a lot of times from NICU families. Okay, I think I'm able to move my slides now. Okay, none of the animations are working. Okay, no worries. Okay, so with oral feeding, from the very pretty early in gestation, so about 26 to 28 weeks, babies are able to start to suck, and we can actually even see this on fetal ultrasound. And then we see this when babies are born prematurely, that they're able to suck on their tubes, whether it's their endotracheal tube or the feeding tube, and their fingers by about 28 weeks. By 30 weeks, some babies, and this is more babies who are kind of more moderately preterm, are able to actually transfer milk. So from a bottle or from the breast, they're able to take teeny amounts of milk in some cases. It's more commonly, though, to need until about 32 to 34 weeks to be able to start to coordinate suck, swallow, and breathe. Now, the earlier your baby is, the longer it will take for babies to reach these milestones. So these are for relatively healthy preterm babies. By 34 to 36 weeks, most babies have a pretty strong rooting reflex and are able to take the majority of their feeds by mouth. And then by 37 weeks, again, should be able to take full feed from the breast. Again, the caveat is the earlier you are, the longer it should take to reach these milestones. Next slide. So how do we facilitate oral feeding in the preterm infant? So there's a lot of evidence for non-nutritive sucking at breast. So that's when you pump and then you put the baby to the empty breast and they might just hang out. They might lick or suck a bit. They might actually latch and get a few drops of milk. But it's really to help the baby start to practice and to figure out what they're supposed to be doing at breast. In a large review, so a Cochrane review of a meta-analysis of about 750 babies, they found that using this in the NICU made it quicker for babies to get to full oral feeds. It decreased their length of hospital stay. And interestingly enough, if you did non-nutritive while the baby was gavage feeding, the milk actually exited their stomach more quickly, which could then potentially improve reflux. Importantly, none of the trials showed any downside. And so this is something that can be done once the baby's off CPAP after about 30 weeks. In our unit, we also do it on CPAP when babies are stable, not having significant events. Next slide. So after you're stable on non-nutritive, obviously the next stage is working on oral feeding. Now, cue-based feeds are really important because we know there are amazing NICU nurses who can feed a rock, but that's not necessarily the best thing to do. We really want this to be baby-led feeding. And so it could start as early as 32 weeks or so, but it really depends on the baby. So if the baby's not ready, we really shouldn't push them. But every day is a new day, every feed's a new feed. So we should be kind of scoring them or assessing them for cue-based feeds if they're not on respiratory support by around 32 weeks. And we know doing this baby-led feeding, whether it's at breast or bottle, allows babies to achieve oral feeding earlier and results in shorter hospitalizations. Next slide. I'm going to talk a bit about the benefits of direct breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. Again, with the caveat that it's not something that's accessible for everyone, but to share the evidence for that, we know that fresh milk, so milk that's never been refrigerated or frozen, has the most bioactives and live cells, such as stem cells, which are associated with improved outcomes in babies. Milk directly from the breast is literally the freshest you can get. And so it has higher concentrations of those live cells that can be helpful for reducing neck and infection. In addition, a recent study out of Western Canada showed that there's less contamination with direct breastfeeding, and you get more of the good bacteria, so bacteria from the mother's breast as opposed to from the bottle and the pump parts. And direct breastfeeding is also associated with better protection against wheezing and otitis, interestingly. In addition, nutritionally, milk directly from the breast can actually be higher in calories. Anyone who's ever put their breast milk in the fridge knows that when you take it out, you have that like thick rim of fat that sticks to the plastic and then really gets lost when you feed the baby. A lot of it stays stuck to the plastic or to the NG tube. And so milk directly from the breast, you don't have that fat loss. It's important to note though that the fattiest part of breast milk is at the end of the feed. So if babies aren't draining the breast, then they won't be getting that fattier hind milk. So it's important to note. It's also lovely for bonding, and then it's portable and efficient, especially once you get home. As you know, we've heard talking from many families that it's challenging to separate that milk removal from infant feeding because it takes so much longer. And so even for 1 or 2 feeds a day, can be really helpful from even just a time management standpoint to try to get some direct breastfeeding in. Next slide. So what do we know about feeding directly at breast as far as how long then babies are likely to have breast milk provided to them? So we know that working on breastfeeding in the NICU, if that's the family's choice, is really important for long-term lactation duration. So there's been multiple studies of preterm infants showing that still providing milk at NICU discharge is highly associated with if the baby was ever put to breast and the number of times they were put to the breast. And even looking at 6 months after NICU discharge, babies that were directly breastfed even once a day in the NICU are much more likely to still be getting breast milk 6 months later. And also babies who are fed a bit at breast have an increased duration of exclusive milk, so that higher milk dose. We also know that exclusive pumping is, as we've recently heard, it's really tough. And it's associated with a decreased length of lactation and more likely to report a low supply, although a lot of these things are interrelated. Next slide. We know, though, that lots of babies and lots of families do need to use bottles. I was definitely one of them. I had my kids in the United States, so didn't have any mat leave. And so my kids were definitely shown the bottle very, very early. In preterm babies, we often start with an extra slow flow nipple if they're a prem or if they've had a complex course. And this really just allows the baby to really kind of run the show with how much volume they're getting, because regular nipples, unlike the breast, don't require a lot of suction to extract that milk. And so babies can get a lot more volume quickly with an artificial nipple versus breastfeeding. So we just have to be cautious. When babies are first feeding, they often need external pacing. And at the breast, they can just stop, and without that vacuum, milk won't come out. At the bottle, you often need to externally pace them. So we don't usually take the nipple out because that can make the baby angry, but just tipping the bottle back temporarily to make the milk come out of the nipple to just give them a break. It's really important, though, with bottle feeding to really only feed while the baby is interested. So it's really easy when you have a bottle and you can see how much milk is left to really want to try to force that last little bit. Like it's only 10 more mLs or it's only 5 more mLs. We wouldn't do this at the breast because we can't visually see how much is left in the breast. But when we can see that in the bottle, we like to try to force it. It's important not to do that. Don't kind of twist the nipple in their mouth and try to get the baby to take those last few drops. When they're done, they're done. And any attempt is a success. If they only took 10 mLs, it's not only 10 mLs. They took 10 mLs, awesome. That was their feed. Put the rest through the NG and move on, and it's still a great thing for them. Next slide. So when moms are starting to directly breastfeed, one of the questions that always comes up is my baby getting enough? Well, if they're in the NICU, they're getting daily weights. But an easy way to measure how much they're actually extracting from the breast, there's a couple different ways. First of all, if you get a similar amount each time you pump, you can put the baby to breast, pump afterwards, and see about, estimate how much you have left. But this device, the test weights, is a really nice way to also exactly measure how much the baby took. So, as you likely know, you put the baby wearing what they're going to wear before feeding, weigh them, put them to breast, and then weigh them exactly the same without touching their diaper or anything afterwards. Next slide. And so these test weights are able to give us within about 2 milliliters, so quite exact amounts of volume taken. You might hear people say that they don't trust test weights or that they don't think they're legitimate. There are ton of papers out there that show us that they are a very valid measure of how much babies are taking. They do have to be properly calibrated, but if they're quite good for helping measure how much baby took. Next slide. So nipple confusion. So this is probably one of those most common questions I get, and I must admit that we don't have a great answer for if it exists or even what it is for that matter. So there was a nice review paper a couple years ago, and the author said that parents considering breastfeeding are not the only ones confused. Basically, we all are. Providers are also unsure about best practice because we have very limited and conflicting evidence around nipple confusion. So in this review paper, they looked at 6 studies that were specific to bottles because nipple confusion can also refer to pacifiers, and so the literature is very mixed. They looked at 4 studies that said yes, they supported nipple confusion. However, most of these studies were retrospective, and so they basically interviewed parents at a couple months of age, and if babies were bottle fed, they were less likely to be feeding at breast in the long term. But that's not at all causality, because if you're returning to work and your baby is getting a bottle, then they're not getting the breast because you're at work, not because they were confused by your nipples. And so that really most of the studies actually weren't very helpful at all. There was, however, an RCT, or randomized controlled trial, a small trial, but it was specific to preterm infants. And they randomized babies to use an NG and breastfeed or bottle and breastfeed. And in that small study, those who used an NG instead of a bottle in the NICU were more likely to be feeding at breast and after NICU discharge feeding at breast. But that's a single small study, really the only evidence of maybe there might be some nipple confusion. However, there's better done studies that says there isn't nipple confusion. In the 2 studies in this review, one was a randomized trial that randomized babies to using absolutely no pacifiers or bottles in the first 5 days of life, or to use bottles or pacifiers if you wanted, in addition to breastfeeding. And they found no difference in short-term or long-term breastfeeding rates between the groups in a randomized trial, so kind of the gold standard. In another interesting trial, they actually looked with ultrasound and other machines at the actual sucking patterns when babies were feeding at a few weeks of age. And they found that when babies are at breast, they use one sucking pattern. And when babies are at bottle, they use a different sucking pattern. However, babies that were mixed fed, so breast or bottle, they were able to do both, and they could easily switch back and forth quite quickly. And so these 2 much better done studies suggest that there isn't nipple confusion. So I'm typically of the school that nipple confusion is not generally a thing. I think some babies do better with one versus the other, especially if they're if they need a certain kind of flow. But overall, I would not be overly concerned about introducing, especially pacifiers, which can reduce the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, or the need for bottles, which in the modern age are, to be honest, like a practical necessity for almost all families. Next slide. And finally, a common question I get, especially from nursing staff, but also from families, is my baby is on fortified feeds, so how do I breastfeed because I can't fortify my breast milk? So first of all, feeds from the breast, as we talked about earlier, often have a higher caloric or fat content, so that can make up for it a bit. In addition, usually when we're worried about, high degrees of fortification, babies are still going to be in the NICU for a bit. And so most feeds are still NG, even if they're starting to work on breastfeeding. So babies are still getting top-ups with often that fortified feed. In addition, once they start to work on demand breastfeeding, if that's in the cards, then they might take actually more volume per day when they're on demand. And finally, if there are significant weight concerns, if babies are breastfeeding more at breast, we can always modify the fortification of the other feeds that they're getting via bottle or NG. So we really have a lot of different tricks up our sleeve that can kind of get around this concern if there is a need for fortification. So definitely not a contraindication to direct breastfeeding. So in conclusion, every baby's transition to oral feeding is different. It's a process for everyone. It's different for every baby. It's different for every family. And it depends on the baby's medical situation, the mom's situation, and the family's overall situation as far as what their feeding goals are. We really should start with non-nutritive feeding as soon as the baby is stable. And if it's part of the family's goal, feeding at breast, at least a little bit, should be encouraged for all orally feeding babies while they're in the NICU to be able to give families that longer term choice. There's some additional benefits of direct breastfeeding in fresh milk and exclusive pumping, although it's definitely done. And we've just heard it was done. I nearly exclusively pumped for about 2 years. I can feel your pain. We know that is associated with decreased milk supply and decreased lifetime dose. But again, we know that it's definitely something that has to happen for some families. And so any amount of milk we can give the baby is amazing. And finally, we can measure intake if we need to. We can do both breast and bottle if we need to, and we can make up for fortification if we need to. So really, there's a lot of workarounds for a lot of these lactation challenges. Next slide. So my references, and then there's one more slide. Maybe. No, there should be one more slide. If that slide didn't get attached for some reason, it was going to be a shout out to the new About Kids Health breastfeeding website. So About Kids Health, as many of you probably know, is our sick kids learning hub for the community, both for families and for providers, and our amazing lactation consultants at Sick Kids, who do a lot of outreach within the hospital and within the community, have put together this a new and updated website with lots of amazing videos, both for the healthy term baby as well as the baby who's in the NICU or the term baby who's sick in hospital. So I really would recommend everyone take a peek at that. Again, it's About Kids Health, and just search breastfeeding, and the breastfeeding hub will come up. So I'm sorry that that link didn't show up in my slides for some reason.
Yeah, sorry that last slide wasn't there, but I'll put it in the comments now so that people can go to that link.
Awesome.
Check it out. Do you have time for a couple questions? I know that you are
Sure.
working today, so you're...
No, it's okay. I'm someone else is covering the transport line briefly.
Oh, awesome. Okay, well, I do have a couple questions.
Yeah.
We're talking about
I'm so embarrassed by my dirty office. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to block. I'm trying to block my papers here.
It's fine. You're working. It just shows that you are authentically at work. In terms of non-nutritive sucking, so you were talking about that can start happening at 32 weeks, and that you can do that while baby's being fed through an NG tube. Is that what you were saying?
Mm-hmm.
So is there any risk of baby getting breast milk through the breast while they're being fed through the NG tube?
Yeah. So even though we call it non-nutritive, the breast is never, when you're lactating, the breast is never 100% empty. So even if you've pumped, it's definitely possible, even if you've pumped and done a bit of manual massage, there might still be a few drops of milk in there. For that reason, we only recommend it for babies. So, for instance, if they're still on CPAP, if they're very unstable on CPAP and they're the kind of baby who, you look at them the wrong way or you change their diaper and they have profound DSATs, they're probably not ready for non-nutritive. But if you're kind of chilling on CPAP, you're very stable, we can do your cares, do your nursing cares and you're fine, or you're not on respiratory support, those babies were, if they get a couple drops, we're comfortable with that. So it's kind of depends on the baby's situation.
Also, so I was really interested in that weight that you were talking about and how you can weigh baby ahead of time and then weigh them after a feed if they're wearing the same clothes.
Yeah, don't change your diaper.
But I'm wondering too, like in terms of, could we just go by baby's cues for that too? And will they tell us when they're full and then we know they've had enough? Or is it like sometimes I find in NICU, and as a NICU mom myself, I know we're very much about those numbers and the weight gain, and you have to reach a certain weight. But at what point does it turn into that, like, okay, you're done eating, you're not asking for more, so you've got enough?
Yeah, no, totally. And I, we're very data driven in the NICU. We, as you said, we do love numbers. I definitely don't recommend doing test weights for like every breastfeeding session. You will go insane.
Yeah.
It's really like it's not recommended at all. It's a tool in our arsenal where, if there are some concerns or it seems like the baby's, feeding well, but we're not having good weight gain, or just as like an additional area to get data if it's needed, or for those babies maybe right before they're going home to kind of guesstimate if they're going to need some extra supplementation, for example. But yeah, definitely like don't like no, you don't need to do that with every feed. Please
I
don't.
know, we don't need another obsession with a weight.
No,
Parents are
no, no.
already like, "You what? You're not gonna weigh them every day?"
Yeah. Yeah. I've had parents ask, like, should I like weigh all their diapers at home? I'm like,
Right,
oh my
right.
God, no, no, no,
No.
no. Like you're fine.
We do have this question from somebody watching. Do you have experience with babies who have developed an
Oral
oral
feeding
feeding
aversion.
aversion from the NICU?
Yeah, so I mean, especially at Sick Kids, we're a referral center for really complex babies. So we have a lot of experience with oral feeding aversion. Unfortunately, in the NICU, we have, a lot of babies that have had like, not great experiences with their mouth. They've had a feeding tube in for a long time. They've had an endotracheal tube in. There's lots of suctioning. There's lots of noxious stimuli that as much as we try, it's an unfortunate part of being in the NICU. So that's why we really strive for oral, like for a cue-based feeding, to really try to make any oral experience with feeding as kind of pleasurable and infant-led as possible. Because what we don't want, like we talked about, kind of twisting the bottle in, like just to get a few more drops. We really, really want to avoid that because those practices are definitely associated with oral feeding aversion. Even with our best evidence in trying to do cue-based, we definitely still see babies that, despite our best efforts, will still need a supplemental feeding source, whether that's home with tube feeds or or G tubes, for example. But the more we can do that's infant-led and infant centered, the better.
And you're so right that if they were breastfeeding, we wouldn't see how much was left in the feed. When you said that,
Exactly.
I was like, light bulb, like, of course. But when we see that little bit more, it's like, come on, you can do it.
Yeah. Well, it's the same with pumping. Like pumping, like, again, I pumped for a very long time. It could, like, the data with pumping can also drive you crazy because you see exactly how much milk you're making or how much milk you're not making. Whereas when you're feeding at breast, you don't actually have that data
Right.
to kind of focus on. So every feeding source kind of has its own checks and balances to make you crazy as a parent.
We've got one more question here before I've let you go. It's again from Petya, and they said, we've come home from the NICU a month ago with an NG tube. How can we wean the NG tube feeds?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think especially a lot of that, to be honest, really depends on the individual situation. Because some babies go home with NG tubes because they still have some, need some minor respiratory support, for example. And, you can't easily eat if you're running a marathon. And if babies are working hard to breathe, it's the same kind of thing. Like we're not drinking a milkshake while we're running down the street. And so until the respiratory issues are resolved, which typically just is a tincture of time, we can't really push feeds. Alternatively, if the issue is more of an actual oral aversion or with suck swallow concerns, that's different, and that would be more working with your OT or your PT to slowly increase the amount of oral feeds, assuming that it's been deemed to be safe and the baby isn't an aspiration risk, for example. So hopefully, if you were sent home with a feeding tube, there should be some community support in place to be working with your speech therapist or your occupational therapist to start to either introduce oral feeds or slowly increase the amount of oral feeds and wean down the NG feeds. So working with your pediatrician and your kind of multi-D team. But it can be a process. It can be many months sometimes. So not to be discouraged.
Thank you so much for this today. Is there anything that you want to leave us with that we haven't touched on?
I think just with breastfeeding, reiterating with everyone else that again, as a mom who lactated for a long time, I feel your pain. It is just because it's natural. It does not mean it's easy. And any drop we can get is amazing for the baby. And so whether you're able to, just give colostrum, not just give, or able to give colostrum, colostrum is amazing for a couple of days, or whether you're able to breastfeed exclusively for 2 years or anything in between, those are all absolutely incredible. So just a shout out to all of our families who go through a lot every day to try to feed their little nuggets.
Thank you. That is the perfect note to end on today. So thank you for your presentation and for those words of support for our families, because like we've talked about all throughout today, it is not easy, and anything that we can do to help our kids and give them the best start, healthcare providers and families working together to do that, we do the best we can.
Indeed, it's all you can do.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today on this special day. This video is going to be available, and all the videos, on the CPBF website. That's CanadianPremies.org. And as I mentioned, CPBF is a charitable organization, and it believes that through education and support, families will be empowered and ready to care for their baby. Visit their website at CanadianPremies.org and consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all of our families. We will see you again. We're going to be back on Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time with special guest and author and preemie parent Dana Gall, who had triplets in NICU. And she says her kids teach her every day to look beyond our differences and see people for who they truly are. You won't want to miss it. We hope you can join us. Bye for now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Preemie Chat. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. We are a charitable organization, and our mission is to empower families of premature babies through support and education. This Preemie Chat series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for NICU families and healthcare professionals. Here every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us experience and knowledge. Also on our website, CanadianPremies.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. And today we are going to bring a mother's story, Melissa Harris, who is the author of 1 pound, 12 ounces, a preemie mother's story of loss, hope, and triumph. 1 pound, 12 ounces is a journey of one mother's determination to give her micropreemie a fighting chance, and the story of that baby's remarkable battle to survive. Melissa Harris' dream of being a mother against shatters Being a mother again shatters when a fertility doctor tells her she might never have another child due to a physical anomaly in her uterus. Determined to persevere, she undergoes 9 surgeries and a year of fertility treatments until she finally gets a positive pregnancy test, only to miscarry both twins within the first 15 weeks. When she got pregnant again, she was told that her baby was also at risk. While lying in a hospital bed for 6 days, trying to get to the golden standard 24-week gestational mark, Melissa makes a decision. She'll give this baby every chance to live, no matter what it takes. And I have here join me today, live from California, US, Melissa Harris, who is a single mother of 2 children, living in Oakland, California. She was on the fast track to being a partner in a mid-sized ad agency when she gave birth to her second child, Sam, and the trajectory for her life changed. She's now a work-from-home account manager for 2 virtual creative agencies in the Bay Area, California. She also volunteers at the neonatal intensive care unit at Alta Bates Hospital, where Sam was born, and helps her congresswoman fight for better health care for all Americans. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me here today. I get goosebumps just to read your bio and your journey, because your book is absolutely remarkable. So I'm very honored to have you here with us today.
Well, I really appreciate the chance to talk with you. I'm excited.
Thank you. So Melissa, let's go through your journey, through your presentation, then we can chat a little bit more afterwards. The floor is yours.
So, I wrote my book, came out in November of last year, and it really chronicles the whole journey of getting to the point of having Sam. And then it really focuses on Sam's NICU experience. And I pulled together just some photos from the book that get talked about at times. And just to note, the one on the cover, that is Sam's actual footprint and actual size in relation to a US quarter. So he was a small little man. I started off my journey to being a preemie mom in Trendelenburg. So I went into labor at 23 weeks and 2 or 3 days. I can't even remember at this point. And the doctors put me into Trendelenburg in the hospital to try and help slow labor down and get me to that 24-week mark. When I entered the hospital, the gestational sac was actually already starting to come out. And so they really wanted to use gravity to put it back where it belonged to give Sam a chance. And I took a couple pictures to sort of show what Trendelenburg was like. This is my daughter, Irene, who was about 4 at the time. And she was really funny. She thought Trendelenburg was like being on a carnival ride because you slide down the bed. But her visits those days when I was in the hospital were just life-saving for me because, as you can see, she is adorable and full of joy. This is Sam's birth record with his footprints and kind of capturing his length and his weight. This was kept next to his isolette in the NICU the whole time he was there. And this is the first picture of Sam on the ventilator. This was taken while actually I was still in recovery, but was sent down to me so I could see him. And you can see the color of his skin is very different. His eyes are fused shut. But other than that, to me, he's just beautiful. A little collection of pictures from the first few times I saw him. So the one in the upper left-hand corner, that is me seeing Sam for the first time being wheeled in. And then next to that is my hand over his. You can see the size of his body in relation to me. The preemie diaper that's actually in the neonatologist's hands, we had to fold that in half for the first few weeks of Sam's life because he was just so small. I talk about the next picture on the top row in the book a little bit, where I held Sam and he put his tiny little hand out on my chest and kind of rubbed my chest. And it just was a really special time for me. Then we have Irene visiting Sam for the first time and getting a chance to touch him. And then just a few more photos to kind of show Sam, including when his eye first opened. I talk a lot in the book about this picture. This was my absolute favorite picture holding Sam. And it's the one that made my brother drink all the tequila in his house because it showed him how just small Sam was. And it's funny, I didn't even register that this was not a normal mother and child photo until my brother was visiting months later and talked to me about it, and just, how small he was in relationship to me. A couple more photos just from our NICU stay. So what his room looked like with all of the equipment, visits from Irene, my mother holding him. And my personal favorite is we made friends in the NICU with another family. And the day before he was released to go home, his mom snuck him out of his room and over to Sam's room for, as we call it, his baby's first play date, which I always found amusing. In the hospital, Sam had a PDA ligation, so heart surgery to close his the artery or the valve in his heart that didn't close. He's got a nice little scar on his back now. I keep telling him as he gets older, he can tell people he got it in a bar fight protecting someone. It'll make him look cool. And then just a couple pictures of the first time Irene got to hold Sam and just the joy on her face and how much he looked to her. And their relationship is still very much like this, with him looking up to his big sister and her being very proud of him. In the NICU, the staff is just so important. And I formed a very strong bond with Sam's main primary nurse, Nurse Laura. And so this is her on Sam's graduation day from the NICU, carrying him out of the hospital. And then no slideshow is complete without these are just pictures from his first year, being held by my father and then by my grandfather, who is one of the two people Sam was named after. So I thought it was important to make sure that was in there. And one of the fun things I've done over time is taken a picture of the size of Sam's hand in relationship to mine, so you can kind of see how he's grown, starting with the first one where my index finger fit into his entire hand, up to now, I'm actually 2 years behind, but his hand is almost as big as mine. And then just for everyone wanting to know, Sam is almost 12 now, and he is thriving. He's funny. He loves car racing. He loves all the pets we have, and he is just a great, remarkable, funny kid.
Wow, thank you, Melissa. This is absolutely amazing and emotional to see how much he grew over the years. I love the pictures hand over hand. I think such a nice thing to do, and to really put things into perspective and not to take any day for granted, right? Because sometimes we forget how little they are in the NICU, and having that comparison is really great. It's such a great idea. I hope other families will follow your idea. So Melissa, but let's talk about your book, because I read your book, and this book is incredible. I'm going to actually share the link here for your website. It's such a great book. But I think my first question to you is, why and what prompted you to write this book a few years later?
So when I had Sam, you're in the NICU and you are bombarded every single day with information, and it's overwhelming. And so I started out writing every day. I would come home. My brother at the time was living in Africa, and I have family in South America. And so I started a blog to update people on what was going on, so that I didn't have to individually write emails or keep in touch. And it was a way for me really to process. You get hit with so much information, and some of it can be so overwhelming. So I would go home and I would kind of write everything I had learned and what it felt like. And then it would kind of release it for me. So it's sort of, writing became therapy. And then also while I was in the NICU, I really craved information. I knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. I was not prepared at all for having a preemie. I didn't know what was involved. I had very little warning. And so I craved books, blogs, anything. And I had trouble finding ones that either were not written by a medical professional who had had a preemie, or that we're really focused on kind of God's will and how it will all be okay if you leave it into God's will. And neither of those were me. And so after about a year or two, I was looking at all the stuff I had written on my blog and what I went through, and I thought, well, maybe there are other people that want a book that's not a medical professional or focused on, religious belief, that just really laid out what the experience was so that they would kind of have a sense of what they're in for. And that's really what drove me. And so I had all this blog information. So I had everything chronicled, which was great. And I decided to sit down and start writing.
Wow. Melissa, did you go back to your notes? Because we were chatting a little bit before, and really struck me is that you have so many details on the book, so vivid, as if they happened yesterday. And I think this is such a great thing in a book, because you can really show healthcare professionals every step of the journey and how each step, each day can make an impact in your life.
Yeah, so the blog really was important for writing the book. I mean, I did write every single day that Sam was in the NICU, and very detailed, because otherwise it would just sort of roll around inside of me. So I would release it into the blog as a place to kind of like, okay, these were the things I was told today, and this is how it felt. So I had all of that. And the other thing was, we live in the era of video phones, and I had a lot of videos. So for example, the dialogue in there for the first time my mother and I see Sam after the recovery room, I pulled the wording direct from the videos of what we were actually saying. So I had so much kind of data that I could pull from, which did kind of help make the book come alive.
Wow, that is incredible. Was this like part of your healing process? Because you went through so much, and you talk about infertility, you talk about the loss of your twins, weeks or days apart. I can remember when you lost them. And, I assume there's some healing to do. Was this process of writing the book helped you to make sense of what happened to you, what happened with your family all these years?
Well, a lot of therapy, let's be clear. I definitely did a lot of therapy. But also, one of the things I found in writing a book is that in order to proofread it, you have to read it out loud. And I had to do that a lot. And I would find that I would weep as I read out loud. And then the next time I'd cry a little less, and then a little less. And so I think acknowledging what I've been through, not trying to hide from it, and letting myself feel, helped me get to the point where now I can talk about the experience, and it is in the past. It's no longer eating at me, because I have cried over it a lot. I have let myself just marinate in all of it and feel all of it. And, talking about it is also a very strong healing thing. I think one of the problems that we have is people that go through fertility and miscarriage often suffer it in silence because it's a taboo subject. And I'm realizing that's a huge mistake, because one, talking about it helps the person, but also you're surprised by how many people you encounter who go, oh, me too. And now you've got someone who, when they say, I understand what you're feeling and going through, they really do. And I have found that to be really liberating and healing as well.
I agree with you 100%. I went through infertility myself. I also had this stillbirth. And I felt like every time I talk about it or I wrote about it, it was helping me, but also helping others not feeling as lonely, because it is a very lonely and silent journey that I think for people like you and I that are very vocal and we share our stories openly, we are supporting others as well. But also, in my point of view, you are teaching so much to healthcare professionals along the book on how to talk to families, or what it was a good experience and perhaps not as good of an experience. So this is the next piece that I want to talk to you about, because you talk about decision-making in the book. And this, as all the preemie parents have gone through that very difficult conversation when you are in preterm labor or you are at risk of delivering early, that you have that conversation, what is going to happen and what can happen to your child if you deliver at 22 weeks, 24, 26. And this is a conversation that stays with parents forever, because we always remember. I've been talking to parents now for 10 years, and this is one conversation that we remember the vivid details. And you talk about that in your book. You talk about the moment you were in the hospital with Sam. He was not yet on the age of viability. And you had these difficult conversations, and you name one doctor, Dr. Doom, which made me cry and laugh because it's so surreal. So let's talk about how was that experience for you, and how did you stay in this state that, yes, I'm going to do whatever it takes?
It was one of the worst. The first perinatologist that came in was Dr. Doom, and he was awful. I mean, to this day, if you ask me what his real name is, I have no idea because I refuse to learn it. He was all gloom and doom and basically said to us, there is no chance. Let this pregnancy go. Just let labor do what it's going to do. Have the baby and do comfort care. And my thought for me was, I had already miscarried at this point 3 children. This was the last time I was ever going to be pregnant because I emotionally and mentally couldn't go through the process again. And I just sort of said to him, well, what if we decide not to do that? Like, what's the other option? And he was very negative, to the point where my mother and now ex-husband basically threw him out of our room because we just couldn't believe how he was speaking to us. And one of the things I have learned is people who have read this book, who have gone through the experience at the same hospital, knew exactly who I was talking about. That he was not just this way with me, that he is Dr. Doom to most. And really for me, I'm stubborn. I'm really, really stubborn. And I knew this was the last chance I had of having a second child. And I just decided, because I'm stubborn, that no, I was going to do this. I was going to get this child to 24 weeks. I actually set a goal of I was going to make it to 30 weeks if I had to. And I just decided that's what was going to happen. And I wasn't going to talk to anyone else who was going to tell me different. And so I just kind of closed my eyes and tuned out the room and let people talk around me. And I just focused. I mean, it was literally sheer stubbornness that I think got me to get Sam to that 24-week mark, that there was just no way he wasn't going to get there.
Melissa, but you also had someone that I don't remember if it was a nurse or another neonatologist who said to you, I'm going to be with you until he is in the NICU, until when you're going into the delivery room. You had a very strong paragraph that I cannot find on my notes right now, but it was such a beautiful paragraph you wrote about this person pretty much holding your hand and telling you that you were in this together.
So I had amazing nurses in labor and delivery. When I first arrived, I didn't know I was in full labor. I just had a little bit of spotting. And so they told me to go to labor and delivery just to check. And the nurse that checked me in was this woman, Tamara, and she was just so calm and positive and loving. And she just sat with me. And, when they discovered I was 8 centimeters dilated and contracting every 2 minutes, and that the gestational sac was coming out and what they were going to do, she was with me. And when it came time to go into the operating room to have my C-section, to have Sam, Tamara walked in like this angel from nowhere as the lead nurse on the OR team. And for me, it was, thank God, she was there when I arrived, and she was going to be there until Sam was born. And because she had been able to calm me down and keep me, was so open and wonderful with me, that she, I was very scared in the OR, and she just kept coming over going, Melissa, I'm here. And I was like, yeah, you're here. And it was great for me. And she was just one of the labor and delivery nurses that got me through. I had another one, Beth, who was with me my last couple of days and who was really the one who could tell that the situation was changing. And she wouldn't leave my side either. She was great. I mean, I was very lucky with the nurses I had in labor and delivery. They were amazing.
That is wonderful. But you also talk about the support of the nurses in the NICU throughout that journey, throughout the 95 days that you were in the NICU with Sam. So talk a little bit about that. Were they coaching you? What made them so special for you?
So what I learned very quickly is the nurse that you have matters more than just about anyone else. They're the ones that are there constantly. And continuity of nursing is vital, because if they know your child and they know, like, if the child is bradying a lot and that's not normal, they know something is different. So continuity of care was really important. And then I learned personality was really important, because while they're caring for your preemie, they're also caring for you. You're the one interacting with them. And I found a few nurses that became Sam's primary. His main one was Nurse Laura, who we saw a picture of, and she was fabulous. She knew how to put me in my place, and I'm a very strong personality. She made me laugh every day. And when I was upset, she was wonderful at sitting down and explaining to me in Melissa terms, as I put it, what was happening, what that meant and what we needed to do. And so by the time I left the NICU, I felt like I had had an entire medical education, because the staff was so good at, it wasn't like, here's a medical term, go look it up. It's, this is a Brady and this is what this means and what can cause it and what we do. And, to the point where they made sure that I was empowered and I was knowledgeable. And a lot of times, while Laura would be in the room, I was responsible for his care. It was on me. And if I thought something was off, then I would get her attention. And so that set me up, I think, to when I brought him home, feeling safe bringing him home too.
Absolutely.
Kind of new things. Yeah.
So what else helped you through the NICU stay, Melissa? You talk about the nurses caring and teaching you, empowering, and you talk about peer support. How was peer support for you? Did it help you through those days?
So my probably third or fourth day in the NICU, I was sitting in the family room and I met another preemie mom. And, in the NICU, you have to do some quick sizing up. Do they look like they're normal? Do you think you can get along? Are they short-termers or long-termers? You don't want to meet the short-termers if you're a long-termer, because they're just going to come and go. And we did a quick looking each other up and down. And she said, I think I've seen your husband in the elevator with your daughter. And, oh, yeah, I have a kindergartner. And she said, well, I do too. We're like, okay, let's see where this goes. And she had a 31-weeker. And to this day, she is one of my closest friends. We just went on vacation together with our kids. Having someone who is experiencing what you're experiencing, who is you're not married to, because they're also emotionally traumatized of things, was invaluable. We joke we're foxhole sisters. That we went through, sorry, just turn the volume off, went through this experience together. And it's kind of like, people who go through a war together. And, if she would say, Bennett had 4 Bradys, I could talk to her about that and be like, okay, well, was his feeding tube in the right place? What do you think caused it? Were there loud noises? And so just having someone you can lean on, who you don't have to explain anything to, who gets the terminology, knows how awful it is to be in that isolated environment, and who also had another child. I mean, if you're in the NICU, go find someone that you can connect with, because for me, that was everything. And we've gone through our divorces together. We've gone through, our daughters are actually at the same school now together. Like there's nothing like it.
Wow, that is incredible. So you did talk about your daughter. Let's talk about Irene. She was only 4 at the time. how did you manage to be in an ICU for 95 days, having Irene at home? How did she process all that at such a young age?
One, I am very lucky. My parents live nearby, and they are very, very involved with Irene. So I had a good support system outside of the house. In terms of how Irene handled the NICU, we did it all wrong at first, all wrong. And I have a cousin who is a child life specialist at the local children's hospital who intervened for us. I actually called her and I said, Rosie, I'm doing everything wrong with Irene. What do I need to do? And she took Irene out and spent a day with her and helped us put a visitation plan for Irene into place. The NICU is very scary for little kids. And a 24-weeker is very scary to look at for little kids. And what we did is we stopped asking Irene if she wanted to go see her brother. And it's because she felt pressure. If we asked her, she felt she had to say yes. Mm-hmm. And so we let it be her asking us if she could see him. And then the deal we had is we had a safety word. So we would go into the NICU, and if she said the word pickles, one of us would immediately get up and say, okay, Irene, let's go, and leave with her with no question, no judging, no nothing. And so it allowed her to feel safe and that she was in control. And it made her visits, it took her about 3 weeks to ask to visit, and she stayed for 5 minutes and then pickled and left. And then over time, she would ask more and more often to come. And that was, for her, it was huge. But then, it's your community. Community is really important in the NICU. I think a lot of times people are scared to ask for help. And I decided when Sam was, I never ask. And when people offer, I always say, oh no, I'm fine. When Sam was in the NICU, I decided I would say yes to everything. And so friends would be like, can I take Irene for a play date? Can Irene come over and hang out with my kid? And I would just say yes to all of it because it gave her normalcy and it gave her things that she could do. So that, it's community, it's family, and it was my cousin helping make sure that her in the NICU experience was a good one.
Wow. So main lessons that you learned in that journey, then I see you, Melissa, asking for help, maybe one. What else?
And accepting the help that you're offered. I didn't have to cook for 4 months because food would just appear at my house. Someone set up a meal train and I was like, okay. People would show up, be like, hi, it's my day I couldn't drive for the first month after I had Sam. And so, people just show up at my house. It's my turn to take you to the hospital. Oh, okay. I just learned to say yes and accept the help of those around me.
That is so important. We just talked about self-care with a perinatal mental health specialist a couple of weeks ago. And she did say that it's not only to ask, but to accept, right? Yep. This is part of our self-care. This is part of us growing the village to raise our children, something that we in North America kind of forgot about that. So it is an important lesson, especially for all of us who experience the trauma of the ICU, the long days away from home, and especially when you have older children at home. So you talk about Sam, he's 11 years old now, and he's big boy, how he's doing now. So do you talk about his journey? Is he aware of how he started life and how far he has come?
So yes, he knows everything. Part of it is when my book first came out, we were with my dad and my dad left his copy of the book on a table and we came back 10 minutes later and the book was missing, as was Sam. And it took us a very long time to find him and he had locked himself in a room and was reading it. So he's actually read the book multiple times. But before that, I had this blog and he had seen the blog, and I feel it's important I'm one of those that I don't think hiding medical history or diagnoses does anyone any favors. So Sam is autistic, and he knows it, and he's known it from the beginning, and he knows that it probably is a result of his prematurity. And so we explained what prematurity was. So he's very proud of his story. And, you know, he medically, he's, you know, again, he's autistic. He's slightly nearsighted, and that's it. He's grown out of some other issues. He had digestive issues. But other than that, I mean, you would never know this kid had been a preemie. If you lined him up and said, okay, pick out the kid that was under 1,000 grams, there is no one that is choosing Sam out of that lineup. No one.
Wow, that is incredible. Melissa, what would be your advice for parents going through the NICU right now on the first year, perhaps at home, because you know the first year is still a little overwhelming for many families. What would you tell them?
Just keep going, I think, is the main one. Keep accepting help, keep talking about it, and know that it will continue to get better. I mean, I know when we first got home, it was overwhelming. We had visiting nurses, we had therapies, we had, you know, speech, occupational therapy. We went to a prematurity play group. I mean, all these things that you're doing. And, you know, on top of all of that, you're comparing your experience to others with term babies. So stop doing that. I always get angry when those, you know, groups like the Baby Center and things have the newsletter, your baby this week should be now developmentally, but they don't have it for corrected age. Mm-hmm. I think also be proud. If your preemie is alive, be proud of that. Make sure everyone knows, because your kid has probably survived more than most people. And I think it's something to be really proud of. I know when I would go out with Sam and people say, you know, oh, how old's your baby? And I would have to debate, do I tell them actual age, corrected age? And I realized why would I spare them from what he's been through? Like, I was proud of what he had done. Like, well, he's, you know, technically he's this, but corrected age, he's that because he was born premature. And I made sure everyone knew it, because he fought, he deserved, that was a badge of honor. So I think be proud of what your child has accomplished, be proud of what you've accomplished with your child. And just remember to breathe and accept help.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. It is really something to be proud of. As you said, they endure more in their shorter life than many adults in an entire life. Absolutely. Melissa, and for healthcare professionals, because you talk a lot about healthcare professionals in your book, the impact that they had in your life, what would you tell them?
I think it's important, especially in the NICU environment, to remember that while the baby is your patient, the parents are also your patients, because we are the ones that can speak for our children. And so remembering to include parents in everything, education, you know, they would have a sheet that recorded input. So how much did he eat? How much did he pee? How much did he poop? All of those things. Really encourage the parents to dive into it. Help empower the parents. I talk about this one nurse who, when I wanted to hold Sam and I sat down all ready for her to hand him to me, and she turned and looked at me and said, "Get him yourself." And I was like, I can do that? She's like, it's your baby, go get him. And so it's really important for the medical professionals in the NICU to empower the parent, listen to the parents' questions, answers, provide them resources if they need them, and remember that they are suffering through everything their child is. I mean, I had days in the NICU where I was not pleasant, and I knew it. And I had nurses who knew me enough at that point could tell me to go home. One actually threw me out and prescribed a bottle of wine even. It was like, you need to go home and drink some wine, like get out, you're unpleasant to be around. But it's just really important to remember when you talk to them, they're humans and they're scared, and they need you to teach them and empower them.
Absolutely. Melissa, if people want to get your book, I'm sharing the name of your book. This is the cover. Where can they find it?
Pretty much anywhere books are sold. So everywhere from Amazon to your local bookstore. If they don't have it at your local bookstore, you can request them to order it. It's available everywhere.
Amazing. So Melissa, thank you so much for joining us here today. It was great to learn from you. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your experience with us. It's so powerful, so important for other families to hear that they are not alone.
No, talk, be vocal. It's really good for you. That's my parting words, is just, you don't need to hide it. Just be vocal, cry in front of people. It's really liberating.
Absolutely. Melissa, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to all of you watching us today, thank you so much for joining this session. And the video of today's session and all the other videos from our live series are available on our website, which is thecanadienpremies.org. And I want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for their ongoing support of our education sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through support and education, we can empower families, ensuring they're ready to care for their babies. Please visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And I see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay well. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, or CPBF. CPBF is a charitable organization, and our mission is to empower families of premature babies through support and education. This Premi Chat series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for NICU families and healthcare professionals. Here, every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us their knowledge and experience. Always on our website, CanadienPremies.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. And today, still talk about the World Breastfeeding Week that just happened last week. We are going to talk about human milk for human babies, how breastfeeding shapes infant development. Breast milk is an extraordinary superfood, providing all of the nutrients a baby needs in exactly the right combination. It changes over time as the baby grows and responds to the mother and baby's environment. Breast milk is also the ultimate personalized medicine, providing protection against infections during infancy and lowering the risk of asthma and obesity later in childhood. These incredible properties of breast milk are related to its bioactive components, including live bacteria and specialized sugars that help seed and feed the baby's gut microbiome. Dr. Azad's team is studying how breastfeeding and human milk shape the infant microbiome and contribute to infant growth, child development, and lifelong health. And I have here join me live Dr. Megan Azad, who is an associate professor of pediatrics and child health at the University of Manitoba, where she holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in developmental origins of chronic disease. Her research program is focused on the role of the infant nutrition and the microbiome in child growth, development, and resilience. Dr. Azad co-directs the new Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center and leads the new International Milk Composition Consortium. She serves as a Deputy Director of the Child Cohort Study, a national pregnancy cohort following 3,500 children to understand how early life experiences shape lifelong health. Dr. Azad, thank you so much for joining us here today. Such a pleasure to have you here, especially during this month of August when we raise a lot of awareness of the importance of breastfeeding and breast milk.
My pleasure. Thank you, Fabiana, for the introduction and the invitation. I'm excited to speak with you today and to share a little bit about my research on human milk for human babies. So we'll jump right in. My team at the University of Manitoba studies breastfeeding, and this is why. So in some countries in the world, believe it or not, up to 20% of infant deaths are caused by suboptimal breastfeeding. So these are data from 2013 from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And you can see this map of the world is color-coded. Down here, I've highlighted South Africa, which is this bright orange color. So in South Africa, about 17% of infant deaths are attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding. That could be for a variety of reasons. It might be because breastfeeding is known to protect against diarrheal disease. And in some developing countries, that is still a major cause of infant death. So if they're not getting breastfed, they're not being protected against those illnesses. It could be that babies who are not breastfed in these settings have to be fed something else, and they might be receiving formula that's mixed up with water that's not safe to drink. So this isn't something we often think about in a country like Canada, but in many countries in the world, they still don't have regular access to clean drinking water, and that can be a source of infection for babies who are not being breastfed. So there are a variety of reasons why suboptimal breastfeeding might contribute to infant death, and you can see in the map that this primarily occurs in developing countries. But I have here a question mark over the US and Canada. So in countries like ours, we fortunately don't have many infant deaths being attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding, but there are still really a lot of important reasons to breastfeed. So this is a pamphlet that's given out by Manitoba Health in my home province about breastfeeding, and it talks about 8 great reasons to breastfeed your baby. And so we've got on here things like it's convenient, it's the perfect food for babies. It actually helps make moms healthier too, which is an area that doesn't receive enough attention. It's better for the planet, so it's environmentally friendly. It builds love, so bonding between mom and baby, and so on. But I'm going to focus mostly today on the research around breastfeeding and infant health. So the evidence that breastfed babies are healthier. And this is because, for example, in infancy, babies who are breastfed have a 36% lower risk of sudden infant death syndrome. They have a 72% lower risk of respiratory tract infections. Later in childhood, they have a 30% reduced risk of type 1 diabetes. And thinking even later into adolescence and adulthood, they have up to a 30% lower risk of obesity. So there are many short-term and long-term benefits to baby's health and to health later in life. And so this is a great quote that I love. I think it kind of sums up my interest and passion for breastfeeding in one great sentence. It says, human breast milk is not only the perfectly adapted nutritional supply for the infant, but probably the most specific personalized medicine that he or she is likely to receive, given at a time when gene expression is being fine-tuned for life. And this is a quote by Cesar Victoria, who's a researcher that led a really brilliant series of papers in The Lancet in 2016, which I would encourage you to check out if you're stimulated today to learn more about the evidence behind breastfeeding, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective. This is a great collection of papers. One of the statistics from that series is shown here. So it's been estimated based on the evidence that improving breastfeeding practices worldwide to the optimal levels could save more than 820,000 lives a year. So many of those would be infants. Like I showed you previously on the slide with the map, there are many infant deaths attributed to suboptimal breastfeeding, but some of these lives saved would be mothers too. So mothers who breastfeed have a lower risk, for example, of ovarian cancer and breast cancer later in life, as well as cardiovascular disease. So the reason I love this quote, it talks about breast milk being more than just food. So yes, it's this perfect nutritional supply for babies, but it's much more than that. So breast milk, as I'll show you later, contains many things beyond just nutrients. And so we can think of these as a sort of personalized medicine. It contains factors that protect the baby from infection, for example. And it's personalized because it's adapted to the environment that's shared by the mother who's making the milk and the baby who is drinking it. And also, this is all happening, this breastfeeding, ingestion of nutrition and medicine through milk is happening at this really critical period of development when gene expressions, or how genes are expressed, is being fine-tuned for life. So this period of early infancy is when a lot of systems in the body become fine-tuned and sort of set into a trajectory for the rest of your life. So this includes things like your immune system, your metabolism, your brain development. These are all developing early in infancy when breast milk is being received. And as we learn more about breast milk, we're finding out about how its many components contribute to these important developmental practices. So Dr. Victoria, as I mentioned, is an epidemiologist who led this great series of papers. He also did some original research back in the 80s. He was one of the first people to show quite definitively that actually formula-fed babies in his home country of Brazil were at higher risk of diarrheal disease and death as compared to babies who were breastfed. And this was at a time when formula feeding had kind of become quite popular and breastfeeding had fell out of favor. And so it was based on this evidence from Cesar Victoria's team that they started to question whether or not formula was really this perfect alternative to breast milk. And subsequently, many other researchers showed this as well. And so Cesar Victoria actually won a Gairdner Prize in 2017 for his work on the impact of exclusive breastfeeding on infant mortality. And so this image is taken from an announcement of the Gairdner Awards in 2017. Some people refer to these awards as the Baby Nobel Prizes because many of the scientists and researchers that receive this award go on in a few years later to win the Nobel Prize. So it's a pretty big deal. And just to re-emphasize that point, these are some of the other winners from Dr. Victoria's years. So Akira Endo won the award for developing statins, which are widely used medications around the world. Louis Kay won for developing nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. That's a mouthful. So a really important scientific technique. And Rino Rapoli developed the meningococcus B vaccine. So these are really important discoveries, important science, and it made me really excited to see breastfeeding research recognized on the same scale. So this is a second quote from that same series, and this one is by the Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank. And he says, if breastfeeding did not already exist, someone who invented it today would deserve a dual Nobel Prize in medicine and economics. And so having just shown you how Cesar Victoria actually has been recognized with a baby Nobel Prize anyway, I think this is a really fitting quote. And I like that it emphasizes not only the health or medical benefits, but also the economic ones that go with it. And then the final quote I'll share with you before I dive into some science is this one, which is a little bit funny on the surface and then also really concerning and sad when you think about it. And it's true. We actually know more about what's in a strawberry than what's in breast milk. And you could replace strawberry with a lot of things, right? Tomatoes or corn, like because of agriculture and the commercialization of it. We know a lot about other foods because they're economically important. And yet somehow we know relatively little about what's in breast milk, which is like the most important food that a new baby is going to consume. And so it's a real knowledge gap that's starting to be recognized by the scientific community in ways, for example, funding more research into breast milk composition. But this is far later than it should have occurred, I think, in my probably a little biased opinion. But we're learning more, but there is still a lot to learn. And so this really is the impetus behind the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center, or MILK with a C, which is co-directed and co-founded by myself and my colleague Nathan Nickel. So I have a background in epidemiology and human milk science. So I'm a biochemist. I have a degree in genetics. So I'm very interested in the science, the molecules that are in breast milk. Nathan has a degree in public health and biostatistics. And so he's very interested in the health policies around supporting breastfeeding, for example. And so milk has these 4 pillars, which you can see here. So firstly, an infant feeding and lactation database. And so this is where in Manitoba, we're collecting information about how babies are fed when moms are coming in for their routine well baby vaccination visits when babies are a few months old. And that's really important because until this database was started, we had information about how babies were fed when they left the hospital after they were just born, because that information would be recorded in their hospital record. It would be noted whether the babies were receiving their mother's own milk or they were getting formula, and that would be captured. And we could use that data for certain types of research, but it's pretty limited. After that, we had no idea how the babies were fed. And of course, those first couple days are important, but what happens after is equally important. And so this information was missing, but we're starting an initiative to capture it in Manitoba so that we can then do all sorts of research around how babies are fed and how that is impacted by different policy decisions, by different maternal factors, and how it's linked to infant health as those babies grow up. And then secondly, we have the human milk biorepository. And so this is the part that I'm leading. And so when moms are answering these questions about how they feed their babies, we're also going to ask them if they would like to contribute a sample of their milk for research. And so we're going to do things like measure the different nutrients in the milk, the different non-nutrient components that I'll tell you more about shortly. And then this information, again, can be linked to what we know about the mother's health, what we know about the infant's health, and tracked forward as the babies grow up. In both cases, so this information about infant feeding, the information about human milk is being linked into the Manitoba Population Research Data Repository. And this is a place where in Manitoba, because of our public healthcare system, we have access to the health records of all Manitobans. And so this would include hospital records, physician billing claims, prescription records, and also some social services data. And so this can all be accessed for research purposes. It's de-identified, but it's a really important resource for understanding health in the province and the impact of different policies. And now we're going to link breast milk data into this important resource, which is really exciting and very unique in the world. And then finally, we have our Milk Club. And some of you in the audience might be interested in this. So this is a group of researchers, trainees, clinicians, and healthcare providers that meets once a month. We meet, initially this was a club, sort of an internal club of Manitobans who were interested in breastfeeding and breast milk from different angles. But as we have been inviting different speakers to connect with us, we've had a lot of interest in opening it up more internationally and external to Manitoba. So we are starting to have quarterly meetings that invite people from outside Manitoba to join us for different talks and discussions. And so you can learn more about that at our website. So moving on to some of the science and the interesting facts about milk. Human milk is a superfood. So I mentioned earlier that it's this perfect nutrition. I think it's not an exaggeration to think of milk as a superfood. So I know that's a buzzword lately, superfood, but really if I was going to say this word fit one food, it would be breast milk. And so, you know, it contains all the nutrients that a baby needs, and it's changing over time to meet those needs as they change. We also can think of milk as a baby's first vaccine. So this is particularly topical now during a pandemic where we know that maternal antibodies, for example, to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, if she's been infected and recovered or if she's been vaccinated, those antibodies are going to be put into her milk and the baby can receive them that way, which is really important because babies are too young to be vaccinated themselves. They can receive this protection from their mother. I mentioned human milk as a personalized medicine. So for all of these different immune factors that are in the milk, we can think of it almost as a medicine. And the personalized aspect is important too. So, you know, a baby who lives in a household where the mother or other family members have developed COVID would receive that protection. And that's particularly important for that baby because it's living in a household where it's likely to be exposed. And you can think of similar scenarios for all sorts of other infections. And I like the catchphrase that human milk is tailor-made for tiny humans. And that's because milk is different for different species, which is the focus of this slide. So milk is different from formula. Milk is different for humans than from any other species. And so you can see here an example of a human baby and a cow baby or a calf. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to see a calf be born, but within literally moments, they are getting up and sort of wobbling around. Where if you contrast that to a human baby is not going to be wobbling around or crawling or walking for many months. It's actually going to spend a lot of time sleeping, and that's because it's devoting its energy to brain development rather than muscle development and movement. And so that's one example of how these two species have very different needs. And so their milk is very different because, of course, all mammals have mammary glands and make milk. That's actually why they're called mammals. But the milk is very different for these different species because of these different needs. And formula is actually made from cow's milk. So the components in it, although it's, of course, modified to try and make it closer and closer to human milk, is really not the same and is ideally optimized for a cow before it gets processed. So you can see here, and I'm sure can't read all the little words, but there's a lot of things in breast milk that simply are not found in formula. Milk also differs between species. So I mentioned cows and humans as one example, but it's fascinating to read about milk from other species. For example, seals Seal milk has the highest fat content of any mammal. And that's because seals are born on like an ice floe, and then they have about a day to drink as much milk as they can to fatten up, and then they get tossed into the freezing cold ocean water. So the fat in seal milk is super high to help them with that. Sorry, I'm not sure. My slides are going a little backwards. Milk also differs between mothers, which is really interesting. And so it's different between species, but not all human milk is the same from mother to mother. So it's going to be different based on that own mother's genetics and based on her environment. So it's highly personalized, as I mentioned. And then we have within mothers. So milk is also different within mothers because it changes over time, from month to month, also from morning to night, and even within each feeding. And so this is because over time, month to month, the baby is growing, its needs are going to change. And morning to night is really interesting. So the milk produced in the morning is going to be different compositionally from the milk produced at night. Night milk, for example, is going to have higher levels of molecules that help induce sleepiness. And so you can imagine that in formula, which is sort of one size fits all, it's the same every time. It's not changing. There's not morning formula and night formula. There's not 1 month, 2 month, 3 month formula. It's all the same. And so that's very different from what a baby received if it was breastfed. And even within each feeding, the milk changes. So it's lower in fat content at the beginning of the feed and higher in fat content at the end. And that's thought to help the babies regulate their appetite signaling. So these are all fascinating things about how milk is when it comes fresh from the breast. And so this is another version of the image that you just saw, but with bigger words. And so you can see here that formula, as compared to breast milk, contains all of the main building blocks, the primary building blocks that a baby needs nutritionally. So that would be macronutrients. We have fat, proteins, and carbohydrates, and then micronutrients, which is things like minerals and vitamins. But then what you see is on top of that, breast milk contains so many other things. So this includes growth factors and enzymes and hormones and antibodies, which we've talked about already. And so these are all things that aren't going to be found in a formula. They're pretty unique to human milk. And then this figure is probably a little bit out of date in that it doesn't include some of my very favorite components. So probiotic bacteria, these are live bacteria that are beneficial and healthy. These are naturally found in breast milk. Prebiotic oligosaccharides. So prebiotics are food for beneficial bacteria. So you might read about probiotics in yogurt or other healthy foods. You can also buy probiotic supplements. And here we go, milk contains it naturally as a component. And then something I won't talk about anymore today, but is very fascinating, milk contains stem cells. So these are cells from the mother that make their way into the baby and integrate into the baby's tissues and presumably play important roles in development. And then food antigens. So this is interesting from an allergy perspective about how food allergies develop and could be maybe prevented by exposure to these food antigens in mother's milk. So a few more words about the pro and prebiotics, because this is one of my main areas of interest in terms of the microbiome, is that milk contains both probiotics, which are live beneficial bacteria, and prebiotics, which are non-digestible carbohydrates that feed those beneficial bacteria. So often we call these fiber. So when we consume fiber, those are carbohydrates that we can't digest on our own, but our gut bacteria digest them for us. And so it's pretty interesting that human milk, breast milk, contains naturally both probiotics and prebiotics. So in that case, I would say there's probably actually 9 great reasons to breastfeed your baby, not just 8. And that 9th reason would be related to the microbiome. So these are 2 famous studies that were published about the baby's microbiome and the importance of breastfeeding. So the microbiome refers to all these bacteria that live in and on our bodies, mostly doing things that help keep us healthy. And so this is a paper that I was part of back in 2013, where we analyzed the microbiome of babies and showed the importance of breastfeeding. And then this was a separate study a few years later that was much larger. And this is my favorite graph from that paper, where they showed that among all these different factors that they studied, so things like antibiotics and vitamin D and maternal body mass index, breast milk was clearly the most important factor shaping the baby's microbiome in the first months of life. And so why is the microbiome important? Well, as I mentioned, these microbes do many important things for us. So they, for example, help us extract energy from food. So those prebiotics, they help us digest. They produce some essential vitamins that we can't produce on our own. They help regulate our immune system, which is especially important in very young babies when their immune system is still developing. They also can help regulate glucose levels and metabolism and so on. And actually, we have 100 trillion microbes living in our body approximately, which is 10 times more bacterial cells than we have human cells. So when you think of just how many there are, it really brings home the point that they must be doing something very important. And so then to know that breast milk is so important for the microbiome really made me think that it was important to understand more about breastfeeding and breast milk and what's in it and how it shapes the microbiome. So that led me to study the microbiome of breast milk. And so it was thought until about 10 or 15 years ago that human breast milk would be sterile unless a mother had an infection. But we now know that actually that is not true. And milk from healthy mothers contains lots of bacteria, enough that babies who are breastfed are consuming up to 10 million bacteria a day. One thing that we still don't know for sure, which is why there's a question mark here, is whether these bacteria in milk are an actual source of gut bacteria. So are they just kind of passing through the baby's intestinal tract, and they could be performing important functions while they do that, or are they actually colonizing the baby's gut? That's something that we're still studying. But here what you can see is that just like I mentioned, milk in general is very personalized. So is the milk microbiome. So here is data from 400 mothers in the child study that we profiled. And these different colors represent different bacteria. And what you can see here is that each column is a mother. And if you look at the one on the left side, she's got almost all orange bacteria, where the one on the right side has got almost all red bacteria. And there's everything in between. So it's very highly personalized, very different from mother to mother. And so we're still doing research to understand why is it so different, what's driving these differences, how is that difference important to the baby, and so on. But it's a really fascinating area of research. So then if we think about those prebiotics, this is a little graphic showing that if you think about milk, it's about 90% water. If you think just about the non-water components or the solid components, we can divide those into macro and micronutrients. The most abundant is lactose, which is a very simple sugar. And then we have fats or lipids. And then actually even more abundant than proteins in milk, which are of course very important, we have what's called HMOs, or human milk oligosaccharides. And these are important. These are the prebiotics that I was talking about. And if we just look at them, there are many different types. This figure shows 10 and then says other more longer ones. There's actually more than 100. And if we focus just on those HMOs, these are complex carbohydrates. So they're sugar molecules, essentially, chains of sugar molecules, but they're complex. So the human baby can't actually digest them. They're not found in most baby formulas. Some formulas are starting to add a few of these HMOs, recognizing that they're very important, but for the most part, they're not present in formula. And we now know that they're digested by bacteria, not by babies. So the baby can't digest these HMOs, but the baby's bacteria are digesting them. And that's important. And we also know that they're very species specific. So whereas I mentioned humans make over 100 different HMOs, we know that mice only make 2 and cows make around 40. So this is one aspect of milk that is very different among species. Earlier, I talked about the fat composition and how seal milk is very high in fat. So HMOs are another component, or MOs, milk oligosaccharides, are another component that's very different across different species. So I mentioned earlier that breast milk is a superfood for babies, but I didn't want to leave you today without presenting some other interesting facts that I think are really exciting about breast milk. So it's not only for babies. There's some really interesting research, for example, looking at breast milk and its application outside of infancy. So this is a really neat study where they're using breast milk to treat individuals. These could be adults or children who received a bone marrow transplant. And the reason they're doing this is because before you get a bone marrow transplant, you essentially have to wipe out your immune system. And that's important because if you don't do that, then your immune system recognizes this new bone marrow from another person as foreign and will just reject it. So they wipe out the immune system before the transplant. But of course, that's very dangerous to wipe out your immune system. And there are a lot of side effects that go along with that. And after the transplant has taken, you want to then ramp back up your immune system. So somebody had the idea that, well, babies essentially have no immune system when they're born, and they rely on breast milk for this immunity while they're developing their immune system. So might it be helpful to give breast milk to adults who've had their immune systems wiped out because of this transplant? And they're finding some really promising results. So I think that's just a fascinating example of how what we learn about human milk can be applied to not just help babies, but people in all sorts of different situations. Another example of an interesting study applying milk science to other conditions is this one, where they're using human milk oligosaccharides, so the HMOs that I talked about, to treat irritable bowel syndrome patients, and finding that this helps restore their microbiome to a healthy state, which can help with their symptoms. So another neat example. And then I also wanted to say a few more words about breast milk as a vaccine, because of course we're in a pandemic and vaccines are on everyone's mind. So I think it's really interesting to talk about this research around COVID and breastfeeding and vaccines. So initially in the pandemic, there was a really quick call to action among breastfeeding researchers, where we wanted to very quickly determine if the virus was passed in milk, because there was initially a reaction that maybe moms with COVID shouldn't be breastfeeding, maybe they might be infecting their children through breast milk. And so quite quickly, researchers around the world were able to get some samples, analyze them, and realize that there's no live virus in breast milk. So breastfed babies are not going to be infected by their mothers. And in fact, what's more is there is protective antibodies in the milk of mothers who've had COVID-19. So it's particularly beneficial for them to be breastfeeding their baby with appropriate precautions. So wearing a mask, for example, to avoid infecting through other means. But that was a really important research to do. And this is also true not only of moms who have COVID, but once a mom's been vaccinated, she's again producing antibodies that are passed through her milk. And that's, for many babies, the only way they can receive a so-called vaccination, because they're not old enough to get a vaccination themselves. And so the WHO and other organizations very quickly made recommendations to clarify that moms should breastfeed even if they have COVID-19. And then, finally, I think there's some really neat research going on about whether breast milk could actually be a treatment for COVID. So for people who've already developed COVID, if they need antibodies, you'll probably recall there's been some research on convalescent plasma. So this is blood products from people who've recovered from COVID being sort of harvested and used to treat other people with COVID. There's also the idea that maybe we could do this from milk. And if it works, that would actually be a lot more maybe convenient than taking blood. A person can only give so much blood before they run out, but they can produce a lot more milk. And so if there was a efficient way to harvest COVID antibodies from milk, that might be a new way of treating the condition. So finally, because I know this is the PREME network, I wanted to mention a study that we have going on in preterm babies. This is a study happening primarily in Calgary with my postdoc, Marilee Brockway, who I think will be also speaking to you this week. And then Jeanette Festival at the Northern Star Mothers Milk Bank, and our collaborator, Claire Arietta. And so what we're doing here is a study to see if we can improve the way that donor human milk is given to premature babies who need it. And essentially, our idea is that there might be a better way to match donor milk to recipient infants. So if you take the analogy of blood donations, we would never take blood donated from multiple people and mix it all together and then give it out to all the recipients. Rather, we figure out the blood type of each donor and match it to the blood type of each recipient. And so we're thinking of doing something similar with milk to see if we can make the outcomes for babies even better than they already are when they receive donor milk. So with that, I wanted to flag that we have a resources page on our milk website. So the link is here. And so I've kind of pulled together a lot of my favorite infographics and education materials and videos. Some, although not most of them, some are generated by our lab, but most are just from other places, but they're resources that I've really liked. So you're welcome to visit the website there. And then I have a little video to show you that summarizes some of our work. And so I'm gonna hit play and hope that it works.
Researchers from the Child Cohort Study invited thousands of expecting parents to join a unique Canadian research project. The researchers hope to better understand how a baby's genes and environment influence its health and development through childhood and later life. Nearly 3,500 families agreed to participate. By following the lives of the babies and their parents over many years, the Child Cohort Study has made many exciting discoveries about factors that influence the development of childhood asthma, allergies, obesity, and other chronic diseases. One of these factors is breastfeeding, which benefits babies in many ways. Child research has shown
All right, great. So this video is available. You can see the link there. It's free. It's on YouTube. We're happy for you to share it with anyone who might benefit. We also have on the Child Study website a page for summarizing the discoveries from the study. And this involves many different topic areas. So you can see here, allergies, asthma. I'm pretty proud that the breastfeeding section is, I think, the biggest section. And so you can visit that website to get summaries of the different studies that we've done. This is an example of what you'll find. So some summaries in lay terms of the results, some infographics that are free to download and share. And so we really want this research to be shared. So please feel free to check those out and to share them around. And so with that, I will close off. I'm happy to take questions and chat. And this is where you can find me on Twitter, on the web. And I want to also acknowledge the many people on my research team and from the Child Study and our funders as well that have contributed to the research I shared with you today. So thank you very much.
Dr. Zad, thank you so much for your presentation. Oh my God, I learned so much from you. Every time you speak, there's something new and interesting and exciting happening in the human milk research field. Well, I have quite a few questions for you. Well, based on all that you present, my question is, are we educating parents enough about the importance of breast milk, not only for when it's a baby, but thinking about the life cycle of the child? But are we also educating enough healthcare professionals to promote breastfeeding? Because I feel that during the pandemic, and this is what we heard from a lot of parents, there was a lot of rush for babies to get discharged from the hospital and just bottle the baby, give formula to babies because they can get out of the hospital faster. So I want to hear from you. What are your insights and your perspective on that?
Well, I think you make an important point. So it's important to educate, honestly, everyone about breastfeeding. So that includes parents, it includes healthcare providers, includes society as a whole. We often say breastfeeding is a societal responsibility. So I think too often it gets put all on the poor mother's shoulders. But really, it takes a village. So for a mom who wants to breastfeed, like that's step one, educate people, and so that mothers will then know the benefits of breastfeeding and make that informed decision. But there's strong evidence, a lot of women, mothers who want to breastfeed don't meet their own breastfeeding goals, meaning that they stop earlier than they planned. And that's usually for societal reasons. So they don't have the support they need at home, from their doctor, from society. They have to go back to work. People look at them funny if they're breastfeeding in the park. So I think for that reason, it's really important to think about all aspects. And when it comes to healthcare providers, that's a really important one. There actually isn't a specialty in medicine for lactation, which is outrageous when you really think of it, right? There's specialists for brains and specialists for hearts and lungs and kidneys and every other function of the body, but there's not a specialist for lactation. So that's something that I think needs to change, and I think will in the coming years, but is long overdue. But even just training, general practitioners, there's no mandatory section in medical school about breast milk and the benefits of it. I actually had an experience trying to convince the medical school at my university that this should be included. And we were initially told, "Oh, don't worry, we've covered that. We have a lecture on breast cancer." And go, okay, that's good, but not what breasts were intended for, and not covering the importance of lactation. So I do think it's really important that healthcare providers get this information so that they're aware, they're part of the team in promoting breastfeeding, and also so that they're positioned to support moms who are having trouble with lactation. And that might involve referring a mom to another specialist, but at least having that knowledge. And when it comes to parents, I do think there's an awareness that needs to be there, and it really should come long before they've had the baby, because once you've had a baby, especially a premature baby, that's a very stressful time. So to just be learning then that, oh, I should really be breastfeeding, like that's too late. So I know there are prenatal care classes that teach about breastfeeding. That's really good. But even that, I think, is later than it should be. So we actually have a project where we're trying to work with schools to teach children about breastfeeding when they're quite young, because a lot of the beliefs we grow up with are entrenched very early. So I think the earlier we can teach children that this is just how babies eat, then they'll grow up knowing that that's important, and embedding it in things like science class, because there's really interesting science around breastfeeding is one of our goals as well.
Wow, absolutely. And this is how we're going to change our cultures in general, right? Educating the young people. This is normalized what it should be really normal forever. But Let's talk about the preterm population, because there's a lot of elements on your presentation that I'm thinking, okay, we always promote breastfeeding, breast milk for premature babies. There's so much research, so much evidence on the benefits on the short-term and long-term impact on the babies. But we also mentioned about, let me look at my notes, on the microbiome. If the mom is pumping the ICU and the milk is pasteurized, do we lose those properties? And if we do, can we recover some of the loss that we might have in the ICU when the babies go home on a full breastfeed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about donor milk, which is from a milk bank, it has been pasteurized. And the purpose of pasteurizing is to make sure it's safe and that there's no pathogenic bacteria or viruses. And so that, unfortunately, will also kill any good bacteria. So we are losing some of the benefits of milk by pasteurizing it. This processing, which is a heat treatment, can also denature some of the important enzymes in milk. But that said, there are still a lot of components of milk that withstand pasteurization, and HMOs are a great example of that. So those prebiotic complex carbohydrates, they are not affected by pasteurization. So donor milk still contains a fully active complement of HMOs. So that's why, fresh mother's milk would be option number one, and then second below that would be pumped mother's own milk, because if a mom pumps her own milk, keeps it in the fridge or the freezer, and then feeds it to a baby, it hasn't then gone through pasteurization. It still will lose some of its bioactives. Some components are sensitive to freezing, some are sensitive to light. So that's why we're still trying to research what are the best ways to collect milk and store it before you feed it to your baby. But then below that, if you don't have your own milk to pump, would be donor milk, which because of pasteurization, as you pointed out, has lost some of its benefits. And then below that, way below that, would be formula, because it doesn't even have many of these components. But we are doing research. You talked about, could we recover some of these things? So there's some interesting research, for example, on could we take donor milk, which has been pasteurized, and could we add a little bit, because some moms might be making just a little bit of milk, not enough to really feed their baby, but like a few drops even, add that into the donor milk and sort of incubate it so that the microbes could grow. So this is still at a very exploratory phase, but that's something that might be possible.
Wow, that is incredible. So let's talk about the freezing process, because a lot of families ask us about the freezing. When you pump, you freeze. Do we lose in a period of time? Do we lose more if the milk is frozen for longer? And also, are the NICUs changing the culture of giving more fresh milk to the parents, to the baby? Because I remember when I was in the NICU, I pumped and it was frozen by the NICU and then defrost and gave it to my baby. So there was I felt there was so many steps. Do we still need those many steps?
So this is an area of active research. So I believe there are some studies going on to look at if we can keep the milk fresh, like does that have an added benefit that's worth the extra work to do that? So that's something that's being researched. But we have found in full-term babies, and the video alluded to this a little bit, we've found, for example, if babies are breastfed, they have a lower risk of asthma than if they were formula fed. But somewhere in between that is babies that are getting breast milk but pumped. And so it suggests to us that there's something about the pumped milk that is not quite as good as fresh milk directly from the breast, so it might be something about the storage process. But it also might be something about the process of feeding at the breast, like that skin-to-skin contact, sort of the interaction between the mother and the baby. So we really want to do more research to understand that, because if it is about the freezing of the milk, then maybe there's something better we can do, right? Keep it fresh or freeze it in different ways, different containers. If it's more about that skin-to-skin interaction, then we can promote that. And actually, even if babies have to receive formula, they can still have skin-to-skin contact. So those are really important questions that we don't have all the answers to, but that we're exploring for sure.
But the bottom line is breast milk is best, is the superfood, the first vaccine. So especially for preterm babies, can you talk a little bit about the benefits for the preterm babies? Because we do a lot of education for families, for healthcare professionals, and it seems that we still have so much room for improvement, so parents can understand and healthcare professionals can promote.
Yeah, so breast milk's important for all babies, but as you say, especially for premature babies, because they are born so premature. Their immune system is premature, their microbiome is premature. And milk really supports all of these things in a way that's especially important for these vulnerable preterm babies. And that's why human donor milk is prioritized for these babies because it's going to make the biggest impact for them. So if a full-term baby is born and the mom isn't able to produce milk, they're not really prioritized to receive donor milk, just because there isn't enough to go around. That donor milk is going to be prioritized for premature babies because it's so important to them, which emphasizes why it's so important to get their mother's own milk if at all possible. And even there's some interesting research around, they call it oral immune therapy, where this is, the baby might not even be old enough to really be ingesting milk, or the mom might not be making enough milk to really fully feed the baby, but they'll still take a little bit on a Q-tip and kind of rub it around inside the baby's mouth just to get that exposure, because there are so many important things, growth factors, antibodies in that milk that are important for the baby's development. So it's crucial. There's really strong evidence that breast milk prevents necrotizing enterocolitis, which can be a very devastating disease for premature infants. We're still understanding how and why it is so protective, and there's some good data that the HMOs are part of that, and that particular HMOs seem to be preventing against NEC. And so as we learn more about that, maybe we'll be able to generate supplements of those specific HMOs to give to babies if their moms aren't able to make milk. But the more we learn, the more we can sort of develop new treatments to help all of the babies ultimately.
Wow, that is incredible. Before you wrap it up, can you touch a little bit on this incredible research that you're doing with Mary Lee Brockway and the Northern Star? I forgot her name. Let me look at my notes here. I have notes everywhere because there's so many pieces of good information. Janet, tell us a little bit about that. Where are you in the study to match the donors to the babies based on the type of milk? I don't know how you call it now. It's not the blood type, it's the milk type. It's going to have a classification.
Yeah, so it's a really exciting study. We are finally going to be recruiting our first babies this summer. So this study was supposed to start in March 2020. So we all know what happened then. We put everything on hold for a while, but we're ready to get going again. And so the premise of this study is that we know milk is so personalized and different between mothers. And so it just seems very basic to mix milk together and give it to everyone. Like there's probably we believe it's important that milk from a mother is matched to its baby. So could we do a better job of matching even in the case of donor milk? And there are many aspects you could think about. So I talked earlier about, morning milk and night milk. So should we have our milk donors mark their packages like this was my morning milk, this is my night milk, and match it in time sense? There are some differences in milk based on the sex or gender of the baby, which is really fascinating. So, should we get donor moms to say, I have a daughter, I have a son, and like give milk matched in that way? What we thought the first most important thing to match on is what's called secretor status. So this is a genetic trait. So every person, not just mothers, is either a secretor or a non-secretor based on this one gene, one letter in one gene. And if you're a non-secretor, this affects all the sugars that coat your blood cells, your gut cells, but also the sugars that you make in your milk. And so moms who are non-secretors are missing certain HMOs in their milk. And we think that maybe it's better for babies to receive a milk that's matched in secretor status to their own mother, because they would have been sort of primed to receive that. Because although they're called human milk oligosaccharides, they are actually present not just in milk, but recent research has shown that these milk oligosaccharides are found even in amniotic fluid. So the baby is like ingesting them as a fetus, even before it's born. So maybe it's used to this certain HMO profile, and then it gets born, and then it would normally get milk with the same HMO profile. But in the case of donor milk, it's getting something completely different. So should we try and make it as close as possible? So that's what we're doing in this study. We are taking a saliva sample from the mom to determine her secretor type based on her genes. And then we, at the milk bank, have separated the milk into batches that's from secretor moms and non-secretor moms. So we have two types of milk, and then we'll give it to babies based on their mother's own type and see if that's helpful.
Wow, that is fascinating. I can't wait to hear the results of that study. I'm hoping we're still going to have time during our live sessions to present these results, because it's fascinating and for sure is a breakthrough research in the world. But Dr. Sadi, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's always so great to hear from you and learn from all your amazing work.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and happy World Breastfeeding Week.
Thank you. And to all of you watching us today, thank you so much. You can watch the video of today's session, all the videos from our live sessions on our YouTube channel or our website, which is right here, thecanadianpreemies.org. And I want to thank our sponsors, AstraZeneca and Medela, for their ongoing support of our educational sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through support and education, we can empower families, ensuring they're ready to care for their babies. Please visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And we'll see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time.